In the scorching heat of a September morning in 490 BCE, two armies faced each other across a narrow plain beside the Aegean Sea. On one side stood the mightiest military machine the world had ever witnessed, a force so vast that ancient chroniclers claimed it could drink rivers dry and darken the sky with arrows. On the other side, barely 10,000 Greek warriors from Athens and their Plataean allies, armed with bronze shields and iron spears, prepared to make what seemed like the ultimate last stand. This wasn't just another border skirmish or territorial dispute. This was the moment when the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance. The Persian Empire, stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of India, had set its sights on the fractured city-states of Greece. Their message was simple: submit or be destroyed. But on the fields of Marathon, something extraordinary was about to unfold, a battle so shocking in its outcome that it would echo through history for over 2,000 years. The story begins not with the clash of bronze and steel, but in the marble halls of Persepolis, where King Darius I sat upon a throne that commanded the largest empire the world had ever known. His dominion stretched across 3 continents, his armies had never known defeat, and his treasury overflowed with the tribute of 100 conquered nations. Yet this mighty king nursed a burning obsession with a collection of small, quarrelsome Greek cities that dared to defy his will. The seeds of Marathon were planted years earlier, when the Greek cities of Ionia, along the coast of modern-day Turkey, rose in rebellion against Persian rule. It should have been a minor provincial uprising, easily crushed by imperial forces, but then something unprecedented happened. Athens and Eretria, 2 cities from mainland Greece, sent ships and soldiers to aid their Ionian cousins. The revolt was eventually crushed at the Battle of Lade in 494 BCE, but Darius never forgot this insult. How dare these insignificant Greek cities interfere with Persian affairs? How dare they support rebellion against the King of Kings? Darius began planning his revenge with the methodical precision that had built his empire. In 491 BCE, he sent envoys across Greece demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission to Persian rule. Most of the smaller Greek cities complied, terrified by the prospect of Persian wrath. But Athens and Sparta gave a reply that shocked the ancient world. They threw the Persian ambassadors into pits, a gesture so outrageous that it guaranteed war. The die was cast. The Persian war machine began to turn its attention westward. The force that Darius assembled for his Greek expedition was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Ancient sources speak of armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians suggest more conservative figures of perhaps 20 to 25,000 fighting men. Even at these reduced estimates, the Persian force was a multinational war machine drawn from across the known world. There were Persian immortals in their distinctive pell with their recurved bows, sated tunics and fish-scale armor, Median cavalryarcha archers from the steppes, and Phoenician marines who had mastered the art of amphibious warfare. Command of this expedition fell to 2 of Darius's most trusted generals. Artaphernes, the king's own nephew, brought years of experience fighting rebellious provinces. Beside him stood Datis, a Median noble whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had earned him the king's confidence. Together, they commanded not just an army, but a floating city. 600 triremes, the cutting-edge warships of their day, carried this force across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean. Their strategy was elegant in its simplicity. First, they would subjugate the Cycladic islands, bringing these strategic stepping stones under Persian control. Then they would make an example of Eretria, the first city to aid the Ionian revolt. Finally, they would march on Athens, crush its upstart democracy, and install Hippias, the exiled Athenian tyrant who had fled to the Persian court years earlier. It was to be a campaign of punishment, a demonstration to all of Greece that defying the great king carried a terrible price. The Persian fleet moved through the Aegean like a plague of locusts. Island after island submitted without a fight, their populations awed by the size of the invasion force. When they reached Eretria, the city's defenders put up a brave fight, but after 6 days of siege, treachery opened the gates. The Persians sacked the city, enslaved its population, and burned its temples to ash. The message was clear. This would be the fate of any city that dared resist Persian might. With Eretria reduced to smoking ruins, the Persian commanders turned their attention to their ultimate prize, Athens. But where to land their massive force? The choice fell upon a broad plain beside the town of Marathon, 26 miles northeast of Athens. It was perfect for their needs. The wide, flat ground would allow their cavalry to deploy effectively, and the bay provided excellent anchorage for their fleet. There was even symbolic significance to the choice. It was here, decades earlier, that Hippias's father had once landed to seize power in Athens, but as the Persian ships beached on the shores of Marathon Bay and their soldiers began to disembark, urgent messengers were already racing south toward Athens. The city that had dared to defy the great king was about to face its greatest test. In Athens, the news struck like a thunderbolt. The Persians had landed. Eretria was destroyed. The enemy was barely a day's march from the city walls. In the agora, citizens gathered in tight knots, their faces grim with the knowledge that their defiance of Darius had brought this catastrophe upon them. Some whispered that they should have submitted when they had the chance. Others spoke of fleeing to the mountains or seeking refuge in distant colonies. But then the voice of Miltiades cut through the panic like a sword through silk. Miltiades was no ordinary Athenian general. Years earlier, he had served under Darius himself during the Persian campaign in Scythia. He had seen the Persian war machine from the inside, studied its strengths and weaknesses, and understood its tactics better than any man in Greece. When he spoke, the assembly listened. Athens would not flee. Athens would not submit. Athens would fight. The decision was not unanimous. Among the 10 generals who commanded the Athenian forces, opinion was sharply divided. Some argued for a defensive strategy, waiting behind the city's walls for Spartan reinforcements. Others wanted to negotiate, perhaps offering tribute in exchange for autonomy. But Miltiades and his supporters pressed for the boldest option of all. They would march to Marathon and face the Persians in open battle. The debate raged for hours until finally, the deciding vote came down to Callimachus, the polemarch, Athens' chief military officer. This was democracy in its rawest form. A handful of men making a decision that would determine the fate of their civilization. Callimachus cast his lot with Miltiades. Athens would march to war. Within hours, the city transformed into a hive of military activity. From every deme and district, the hoplites gathered. These were not professional soldiers, but citizen warriors, shopkeepers and farmers who had trained since boyhood in the art of war. They came carrying the bronze-faced shields that had been passed down through their families, wearing the linen corselets their wives had woven, gripping the ash-wood spears their fathers had wielded. 9,000 strong, they represented the flower of Athenian manhood. As the Athenian army prepared to march, a lone figure raced northward along the dusty mountain paths towards Sparta. Phidippides, Athens' finest long-distance runner, carried with him the most crucial message of his life. His mission was desperate, almost impossible. Cover the 150 miles to Sparta in 2 days and convince the warrior city to send aid. Every stride he took carried the hopes of his people. Every breath burned with the urgency of his task. But even as Phidippides pushed his body to its limits, both armies knew that help might come too late. The Spartans were celebrating the Cannae, their sacred festival to Apollo, and religious law forbade them from marching to war until the moon was full. The Athenians would have to face this trial alone, save for one small beacon of hope. Word had reached the tiny city of Plataea, Athens' faithful ally, and 1,000 Plataean warriors were already marching south to join their friends. The Athenian force that assembled in the pre-dawn darkness was a sight to stir the hearts of poets. These men were the embodiment of the Greek ideal, citizens who had chosen freedom over servitude, democracy over tyranny. They wore no uniform armor, carried no standard weapons. Some bore shields inherited from grandfathers who had fought the tyrants. Others carried spears forged just days before. What united them was not equipment, but purpose. They were fighting not for conquest or glory, but for the right to govern themselves. At their head rode Miltiades, his weathered face grim with determination. He had spent the night poring over reports from Marathon, studying the terrain, calculating odds that seemed impossible to overcome. The Persians outnumbered his force by more than 2 to 1. They possessed cavalry, those dreaded horsemen who could shatter infantry lines with thundering charges. Their archers could darken the sky with arrows, raining death from distances where Greek spears could not reach. By every measure of military science, the coming battle should be a massacre. Yet Miltiades saw something his fellow generals missed. The Persians had chosen their battlefield for its advantages, but every advantage could become a weakness if exploited correctly. The wide plain of Marathon was indeed perfect for cavalry, but it was bounded by marshes on one side and steep hills on the other. If the Greeks could control the terrain, they might neutralize the Persian mounted troops. The flat ground that seemed so favorable to their enemies could become a killing field if approached with the right tactics. As the sun climbed higher, the two armies came within sight of each other across the narrow plain. The contrast was stark and intimidating. The Persian host spread across the landscape like a glittering sea, their colorful banners snapping in the morning breeze. Median cavalry wheeled and pranced on the flanks, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust. In the center, rank upon rank of infantry stood in perfect formation, their shields and spear points catching the sunlight like scattered jewels. The Greeks formed up in a much more modest display. Their bronze-faced shields created a wall of burnished metal, but their line seemed pitifully thin compared to the Persian host. Some of the younger hoplites felt their courage waver as they gazed upon their enemies. Never before had a Greek army faced such numbers in open battle. Never before had so much depended on so few. For 4 days, the armies faced each other in a deadly game of patience. Neither commander wanted to make the first move. The Persians expected the Greeks to attack first, allowing them to blunt the assault with arrows before unleashing their cavalry. The Greeks hoped to hold their position until Spartan reinforcements arrived, but with each passing hour, the psychological pressure mounted. Soldiers on both sides sharpened weapons that were already razor-sharp, checked armor that had been inspected a dozen times, and tried to read the future in the flight of birds overhead. It was during these tense days of waiting that Miltiades refined the battle plan that would change history. He had noticed something crucial about the Persian deployment. Their best troops, the Persians and Sarki, held the center of their line. The flanks were composed of less reliable allies and subject peoples who might break if pressed hard enough. Here was the key to victory, if he had the courage to use it. The plan he devised was audacious beyond belief. He would deliberately weaken his own center, stretching his line to match the Persian frontage while concentrating his strength on the wings. When battle was joined, he would allow his center to bend, perhaps even break, while his reinforced flanks crashed into the Persian wings. If his timing was perfect, if his men held their nerve, the Persian flanks would crumble, and his victorious wings could wheel inward to surround the enemy center. It was a strategy that violated every principle of Greek warfare. For generations, hoplite armies had fought with deep, solid formations designed to smash through enemy lines by sheer weight and momentum. What Miltiades proposed was the opposite, a calculated risk that could either win the battle or destroy his army in the attempt. When he explained the plan to his fellow generals, some thought he had lost his mind. Others saw the desperate genius behind the madness. The decision came on the 5th day, when Persian cavalry was spotted leaving the battlefield. Whether they had been recalled for some other mission or were simply watering their horses, their absence created the opportunity Miltiades had been waiting for. Without their mounted arm, the Persians would have to fight as infantry, neutralizing one of their greatest advantages. It was now or never. The Greek battle cry echoed across the plain as 10,000 voices roared their defiance at the Persian host. The sound sent chills down the spines of hardened Persian veterans who had conquered half the known world. Never before had they faced an enemy that seemed so eager for battle, so contemptuous of overwhelming odds. As the Greek phalanx began its advance, Persian archers nocked their arrows and prepared to unleash the storm that had broken so many enemy armies. But something unprecedented was happening. The Greeks were not walking into battle as armies had done for centuries. They were running. The sight was so shocking that Persian commanders stared in disbelief. Surely these madmen would arrive at the Persian lines exhausted and disorganized, easy prey for disciplined troops. Yet the phalanx held together as it charged, bronze shields locked, spear points lowered, their war cry growing louder with each stride. The arrows came in black clouds, hissing through the air like deadly rain. Shields sprouted feathers like hedgehogs. Men stumbled and fell, but the charge never faltered. The Greeks had learned from bitter experience that the only way to survive an arrow storm was to get through it as quickly as possible. Better to risk exhaustion than to stand still and be shot to pieces. When the lines finally met, the collision shook the earth itself. The crash of bronze on bronze echoed like thunder across the plain as 10,000 Greeks slammed into the Persian line. Spear points found gaps in armor, shields splintered under the weight of the charge, and men screamed as they grappled in the deadly embrace of close combat. The Persian front ranks, caught off guard by the speed of the Greek assault, staggered backward under the impact. Exactly as Miltiades had predicted, the battle unfolded in 3 distinct phases. On the Greek right wing, the tribe of Ajax pressed forward with relentless fury, their bronze spears punching through Persian shields like paper. The Persians on this flank, mostly conscripted troops from subject nations, had little stomach for this kind of brutal hand-to-hand combat. Within minutes, their line began to buckle and break. On the left wing, the Plataeans fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland. Though outnumbered, they knew that defeat meant the destruction of their city and the enslavement of their families. Their captain Arimnestos led from the front, his sword dripping with Persian blood as he carved a path through enemy ranks. The Persian left flank, already shaken by the ferocity of the assault, began to crumble. But in the center, disaster was unfolding exactly as Miltiades had planned. The thin Greek line, only 4 ranks deep in steer Persian pressure, the elite Persian immortals and of the usual 8, bent like a bow under their Sakai allies, pushed forward with disciplined precision, their longer spears finding Greek flesh, their arrows creating gaps in the phalanx. Step by step, the Athenian center gave ground. To the Persian commanders watching from their elevated position, victory seemed assured. Their best troops were breaking through the Greek line, splitting the enemy army in 2. Soon they would be in the Greek rear, and the battle would become a rout. But they had not counted on the iron discipline of the Athenian hoplites or the tactical genius of their general. The men in the Greek center, led by the future statesman Aristides and the young Themistocles, fought with grim determination even as they retreated. They knew their role in Miltiades' plan. They were the anvil upon which the battle would be decided. Every step they yielded, every life they sacrificed, was buying time for the wings to complete their work. Then came the moment that would be remembered for centuries. As the Persian center pressed forward in pursuit of the retreating Greeks, they suddenly found themselves isolated. The collapse of their flanks had created a deadly trap. The victorious Greek wings, having routed their opponents, now turned inward like the closing jaws of a great beast. The Persians in the center suddenly realized their peril. Behind them, their own fleeing troops blocked any retreat. To their left and right, Greek spearmen were closing in, their bronze-tipped weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. Ahead of them, the supposedly broken Greek center had stopped retreating and was forming up for a counterattack. They were surrounded. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. Trapped in the killing ground of their own making, the Persian center collapsed into chaos. Warriors who had conquered Egypt and Babylon found themselves pressed so tightly together they could barely lift their weapons. The Greek pincers closed with merciless efficiency, bronze spears finding Persian flesh from 3 sides at once. 6,400 Persian dead would litter the field before the sun set, while the Greeks lost only 192 men. The survivors fled to their ships in panic, abandoning weapons, banners, and wounded comrades in their desperate flight to the sea. But even there, Miltiades gave them no respite. Understanding that the Persian fleet might sail around Cape Sunion to attack Athens directly, he force-marched his exhausted warriors back to the city in a single day. When the Persian ships appeared off the coast of Phaleron, they found the same bronze shields that had defeated them at Marathon waiting on the shore. The Persian dream of conquering Greece died on the fields of Marathon. More than that, the impossible victory proved that the mightiest empire on earth could bleed, could be beaten by free men fighting for their homeland. The shockwaves of this single battle would ripple across centuries, inspiring the golden age of Athens, the rise of democracy, and the flowering of philosophy and art that still shapes our world today. Marathon was more than a military victory. It was proof that courage, intelligence, and the unbreakable will to be free could triumph over any odds. In an age when empires seemed invincible and individual cities powerless, 10,000 Greeks showed the world that sometimes, just sometimes, David really can slay Goliath. In the scorching heat of August, 480 years before Christ was born, a narrow mountain pass in Greece became the stage for one of history's most legendary confrontations. Here, where sulfur springs bubbled from the earth and gave the place its ominous name, the Hot Gates, a small band of warriors would face the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever assembled. This was not just a battle between armies. It was a collision between two entirely different worlds, two philosophies of life and death, freedom and submission. On one side stood the might of the Persian Empire, stretching from the sands of Egypt to the mountains of India, ruled by a king who claimed to be the representative of God on earth. On the other stood a handful of Greek warriors, led by men who believed that freedom was worth more than life itself. The Persians came with numbers that seemed to blot out the horizon. The Greeks came with something else entirely, a conviction so fierce it would echo through 25 centuries of human memory. This is the story of 300 Spartans and their king Leonidas, who chose to die rather than kneel. But it's also the story of how their sacrifice ignited a flame that would burn down the greatest empire on earth. The battle that followed would reshape the ancient world and plant the seeds of everything we call Western civilization today. It would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the size of your army, but the strength of your conviction. The year was 480 BCE, and across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, in the golden halls of Persepolis, Xerxes I sat upon a throne that commanded the largest empire humanity had ever known. From the Nile Delta to the Hindu Kush, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, his banners flew over lands that held perhaps 50 million souls. He was called the King of Kings, the Great King, the ruler who cast his shadow over 3 continents. Yet for all his power, for all the tribute that flowed like rivers into his treasury, Xerxes nursed a wound that would not heal. 10 years earlier, his father Darius had sent an expedition across the sea to punish 2 insignificant Greek cities that had dared support a rebellion in Persian territory. That expedition had ended in catastrophe at a place called Marathon, where outnumbered Greek warriors had shattered the Persian army and sent its survivors fleeing back across the sea in shame. For Persia, a power that measured its strength in the submission of nations, this defeat was more than a military setback. It was a crack in the foundation of imperial invincibility, a whisper that even the mightiest empire could bleed. Darius had sworn to return, to burn Athens and Sparta to ash, but death had claimed him before he could make good on that oath. Now that burden fell to his son, and Xerxes would not make his father's mistake. He would not send an expedition, he would come himself, at the head of an army so vast that resistance would seem not just futile, but insane. For 4 years, the machinery of empire had turned toward this single purpose. From every corner of the known world, soldiers had been summoned. Immortals from Persia itself, their ranks always kept at exactly 10,000 strong. Scythian horsemen from the steppes, their bows deadly atop. Galician sailors whose ships ruled the Mediterranean. Indian war elephants that could crush a man in armor like an eggshell. Arab camel riders, Ethiopian spearmen with shields of zebra hide, Thracian peltasts with their crescent shields and javelins. The numbers were staggering. Ancient chroniclers would later claim that Xerxes assembled over 2 million fighting men, though modern scholars believe the true figure was closer to 200,000. Even at that reduced estimate, it represented the largest military force ever assembled in the ancient world, an army that stretched for miles when on the march, consuming the countryside like a plague of locusts. But if Persia was a vast empire united under one man's will, Greece was its perfect opposite, a fractured landscape of over 1,000 independent city-states, each jealously guarding its own laws, its own gods, its own vision of how free men should live. Athens and Sparta, the 2 most powerful, were as different as fire and ice. Athens buzzed with merchants and philosophers, its citizens gathering in the agora to debate and argue, its navy patrolling sea lanes thick with trade. It was democracy in its infancy, chaotic and brilliant and alive with possibility. Sparta was something else entirely, a warrior state forged in the crucible of constant warfare, where boys were taken from their mothers at 7, and molded into living weapons. Here, there were no merchants or philosophers, only soldiers and the women who bore them. Here, death in battle was not feared but welcomed, and to return home carrying your shield meant victory, while to be carried upon it meant honor. The Spartans had a saying that summed up their entire philosophy of backlife: come with your shield or on it. These two cities had been enemies more often than allies, their rivalry stretching back generations. But now, as Persian scouts probed the northern borders and refugees brought tales of an approaching horde, something unprecedented happened. Fear of Persian domination forced Greece's quarreling city-states into an alliance that should have been impossible. In the spring of 481 BCE, representatives from dozens of cities gathered at the narrow isthmus of Corinth. There, in a moment that defied centuries of Greek, they see tradition or an oath that transcended their ancient rivalries. They would stand together against the Persian tide. Sparta would lead the land forces, Athens would command the fleet, and together they would show the world that free men could not be conquered by slaves, no matter how many millions Xerxes brought across the sea. The strategy was born from necessity and shaped by Greece's mountainous terrain. The Persians could not simply march south and overwhelm the Greek cities. Geography itself would be their ally. Greece was a land of narrow passes and steep valleys, of coastal straits where ships could be bottlenecked and destroyed. If they chose their ground carefully, the Greeks could turn their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. The first line of defense would be at Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, where the mountains came down almost to the sea and left only a narrow corridor through which any army would have to pass. Here, the Persian advantage in numbers would mean nothing. Here, a few thousand determined men could hold back an empire. The question was not whether such men existed, be found. The question was whether they could, in time. Meanwhile, in the north, the Persian juggernaut continued its inexorable advance. Xerxes had not simply assembled an army. He had moved the entire apparatus of empire across the Hellespont on two massive pontoon bridges, each of ancient marvel engineering that took months to complete. Hundreds of ships lashed together, covered with planks and earth so solid that horses could gallop across without fear. When storms destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes had flown into such a rage that he ordered the sea itself punished with 300 lashes. Whether this tale was truth or propaganda, it captured something essential about the man who now led the greatest invasion in ancient history. This was not a king who accepted limits, whether imposed by nature or by men. The army that crossed into Europe was unlike anything the world had seen. It moved like a living thing, consuming everything in its path, leaving behind a trail of trampled earth and empty storehouses. Villages that submitted were spared, but stripped of supplies. Those that resisted were erased from the map, their populations sold into slavery, their buildings reduced to ash and rubble. As summer deepened and the Persian host rolled south through Thrace and Macedonia, word of their approach spread faster than their actual advance. Refugees clogged the roads with tales of an army that drank rivers dry and blotted out the sun with their arrows. Some cities, seeing the futility of resistance, sent Greek earth and water to Xerxes as tokens of submission. Others simply evacuated, their populations fleeing south ahead of the storm. But at Thermopylae, a different kind of preparation was underway. King Leonidas of Sparta had made his choice, and it was a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of Western civilization itself. The festival of Cannae was sacred to the Spartans, a time when their armies were forbidden to march to war. The Olympic Games were also underway, and their ancient truce made military action doubly blasphemous. Yet Leonidas knew that waiting for religious obligations to end would mean watching Xerxes march unopposed into the heart of Greece. The king faced an impossible choice between sacred law and national survival. His solution was as brilliant as it was audacious. He would not take the full Spartan army, for that would violate every tradition his people held dear. Instead, he would lead a personal expedition, a royal bodyguard of 300 men chosen not for their youth but for their experience. These were the Hippies, the elite warriors who had already proven themselves in countless battles. More importantly, each had been selected because he had living sons to carry on his bloodline. They were men who could die without leaving Sparta weakened. The 300 were not young heroes seeking glory. They were fathers and husbands, veterans whose beards were streaked with gray, whose bodies bore the scars of a dozen campaigns. They understood what this mission meant, what it demanded. When their wives and mothers came to see them off, the women of Sparta spoke words that would echo through eternity. "Come back with your shield," they said, "or on it." But the 300 would not stand alone. As Leonidas marched north through the rocky passes of the Peloponnese, his small force was joined by contingents from across Greece. 700 Thespians volunteered to fight beside the Spartans, knowing full well they marched to certain death. 400 Thebans were compelled to join, their loyalty uncertain but their presence required. Soldiers from Phocis, from Locris, from a dozen smaller cities swelled the ranks. By the time they reached Thermopylae, Leonidas commanded roughly 7,000 men. Against any normal army, it would have been suicide. Against the Persian horde, it was something beyond suicide. It was a deliberate act of defiance that said some things were worth dying for, that freedom had a price that free men were willing to pay. The pass itself was perfectly suited for their desperate gamble. At its narrowest point, the corridor between mountain and sea was barely 50 feet wide. Here, the Phocians had built a defensive wall in earlier times, and Leonidas ordered it rebuilt and strengthened. Behind this barrier, his men would make their stand. The position was as much psychological as it was tactical. Any army wanting to march south would have to come through this bottleneck, and here the Persians would discover that numbers alone could not guarantee victory. The pass would force them to attack in narrow columns, negating their advantage in cavalry and archery. More importantly, it would force them to fight the kind of battle that Greeks had been perfecting for generations. The phalanx was more than a military formation. It was the physical embodiment of Greek ideals about citizenship and courage. Each hoplite carried a bronze shield that covered not just himself, but half the man to his left. To break and run meant exposing your neighbor to death. To stand firm meant trusting the man on your right to protect you in turn. It was democracy made flesh, a system where survival depended on every citizen doing his duty. The Spartan phalanx was the most fearsome version of this formation. Their shields were polished to mirror brightness. Their bronze breastplates gleamed like gold, and their long spears formed a forest of iron points that could stop any charge. But it was not their equipment that made them deadly. It was their training, their discipline, their absolute refusal to yield ground no matter what came against them. As the Greek forces settled into their positions, scouts brought word that the Persian advance guard had been spotted. The horizon to the north was dark with dust clouds, and refugees spoke of an army that stretched beyond the edges of sight. Xerxes was coming, and with him came the fate of the world. On the third day after their arrival at Thermopylae, the Greeks saw them. First came the cavalry scouts, their horses picking their way carefully down the mountain paths. Then came the standards and banners, a rainbow of colors representing every corner of the Persian Empire. Finally came the army itself, a river of humanity that flowed down from the hills like a force of nature. They made camp across the plain north of the pass, and their tents stretched to every horizon. Cooking fires sparkled like stars in the gathering dusk, and the sound of their voices was like the murmur of the sea. For 3 days, they continued to arrive, until the very earth seemed to groan under their weight. Xerxes established his royal pavilion on a hill overlooking the pass, a palace of silk and gold from which he could watch the coming slaughter. He sent heralds to the Greek camp with an ultimatum that had brought nations to their knees. "Surrender your weapons," the message read, "and you will be spared. Continue this madness, and you will all die." Leonidas sent back a reply that became legend. "Molon Labe," he said. "Come and take them." On the 4th day, the killing began. Xerxes sent forward the Medes and Scythians, warriors from the heartland of his empire, expecting them to sweep aside this token resistance in a matter of hours. They advanced in dense columns, their war cries echoing between the cliffs, their weapons glittering in the morning sunday. The Greeks waited in silence. When the Persians came within spear range, the phalanx struck like a bronze-tipped thunderbolt. The front rank leveled their spears and charged, their shields locked together, their voices raised in the ancient war cry that had terrified enemies for centuries. The collision was like the crash of waves against stone. The Persian front ranks crumpled under the impact. Men fell screaming, pierced by spear points that punched through leather and bronze. Those behind pressed forward, driven by their own momentum and the pressure of thousands more behind them. But the pass was too narrow, the Greek line too solid. Bodies piled up in windows, the living stumbling over the dead, the narrow corridor becoming a charnel house. For hours the battle raged without pause. The Persians hurled themselves forward in wave after wave, only to break against the Greek shields like surf against a seawall. When their spears shattered, the Greeks drew their swords. When their swords broke, they fought with daggers and bare hands. The ground grew slick with blood, and still they held. By midday, the Persian assault had faltered. Their commanders called for a retreat, leaving behind carpets of dead that stretched back toward their camp. Xerxes watched from his golden throne, his face growing darker with each failed attack. This was not how empires conquered their enemies. This was not sun began its descent toward the western mountains, how the King of Kings claimed his victories. As the Xerxes made his decision, he would send forward his immortals, the 10,000 elite guards who had never known defeat. Surely these professionals could accomplish what the provincial levies had failed to do. But the immortals found the pass no more yielding than had their predecessors. Their wicker shields splintered against Greek bronze. Their short spears snapped against the longer doru of the phalanx. The narrow ground that should have been their highway to victory became their tomb. By evening, they too were streaming back toward their lines, leaving behind hundreds of their supposedly immortal dead. The first day belonged to Greece. The second dawn broke with a crimson sky, as if the heavens themselves were stained with the blood of the previous day's slaughter. Across the Persian camp, the mood had shifted from confident anticipation to grim determination. The bodies of the immortals lay stacked like cordwood, waiting for the funeral pyres that would consume them. These were men who had conquered Babylon, who had brought Egypt to its knees, who had never tasted defeat. Yet here, in this god-forsaken mountain pass, they had been broken by a handful of Greeks who refused to die. Xerxes rose before the sun, his sleep haunted by the sight of his elite warriors fleeing in disorder. The great king who had commanded the submission of nations now faced a humiliation that threatened very foundation of his power. Word of the previous day's failure would spread through the camp like wildfire, and with it would come doubt. If the immortals could not break through, what force on earth could? The answer came from his advisors, men who had studied warfare in a dozen kingdoms. The Greeks, they argued, were fighting with desperate courage, but courage could not sustain men forever. They would tire, their ranks would thin, their weapons would dull. All that was needed was persistence, wave after wave of attacks that would grind them down like grain beneath a millstone. The Persian Empire and an inexhaustible supply of men. Eventually, mathematics would triumph over heroism. But mathematics required time, and time was a luxury Xerxes could not afford. Every day spent at Thermopylae was a day that allowed the Greek fleet to strengthen its positions at Artemisium. Every hour of delay gave Athens more time to evacuate its population, Sparta more time to mobilize its full army. The invasion that was meant to crush Greek resistance in a single devastating blow was becoming a siege, and sieges were dangerous things for empires that depended on the myth of invincibility. As the sun climbed higher, the Persian host stirred to life once more. This time, Xerxes had assembled a different kind of force. Instead of relying on the disciplined formations of his elite units, he would unleash the wild fury of the empire's most savage tribes, Scythian horsemen who drank the blood of their enemies, Thracian peltasts who had learned warfare in the brutal mountains of the north, Ethiopian warriors who had never known defeat in their desert homeland. These were men who fought not for pay or imperial glory, but for the pure joy of killing. They had no complex tactics, no elaborate formations. They would simply charge forward and overwhelm the Greeks through sheer ferocity and numbers. Surely no defensive line could withstand the primitive fury of 10,000 screaming barbarians. The Greeks watched this new assault develop with the calm efficiency of veteran soldiers. They had seen the bodies from the previous day, had counted the Persian dead, and found their own losses to be almost negligible. The pass was holding, the strategy was working, and confidence flowed through their ranks like wine. When the Persian war horns sounded and the tribal warriors began their charge, the phalanx was ready. But this attack was different from the disciplined advances of the day before. The barbarian tribes came forward in a howling mass, their painted faces twisted with rage, their weapons raised high above their heads. They had no formation to maintain, no order to preserve. They were a human avalanche of steel and fury, and they struck the Greek line with the force of a thunderclap. For a moment, the phalanx wavered. The sheer violence of the assault, the demonic screams of warriors who seemed more beast than man, tested the nerves of even the most seasoned veterans. Shields battled the impact offled under axes, spear points found gaps in armor, and Greek blood began to flow for the first time since the battle began. But if the barbarians fought with savage fury, the Greeks fought with something more powerful. Discipline forged in the crucible of a lifetime's training. Even as their comrades fell around them, the survivors closed ranks and hell bent their ground. The phalanx but did not break, absorbing the Persian charge like a sponge absorbing water. And then, with mechanical precision, it began to push back. The slaughter that followed was even more terrible than the previous day's carnage. The barbarian warriors, magnificent in their individual courage, had no answer for the coordinated thrust of the phalanx. They died in heaps before the Greek shields, their wild charges breaking like waves against an immovable cliff. By reach the time the Sund at zenith, the pass was choked with bodies, and the survivors were streaming back toward their lines in panic. Xerxes watched this second failure, his golden from throne, his hands clenched into fists that trembled with rage. 2 days, 2 defeats, and still there the Greeks held impossible position. His advisors fell silent, unwilling to meet the gaze of a king whose fury could mean death. Who dis for anyone the great pleased him. King who had bridged the Hellespont and commanded the loyalty of 50 million subjects was being humiliated by 300 Spartans and a handful of their allies. But if the second day had been a disaster for Persian arms, it had also a crucial reveal weakness in the Greek position. During the fiercest fighting, scouts had noticed Greek warriors being rotated out of the front line when they grew tired. The defenders were managing their strength carefully, ensuring that fresh troops always faced the Persian assault. This was intelligent tactics, but it also meant that the Greek force was smaller than it appeared. They could not afford heavy casualties, could not sustain a prolonged battle of attrition. More importantly, prisoners taken during the fighting had revealed disturbing intelligence about Greek intentions. This was not a desperate last stand by men trapped in an impossible position. This was a deliberate sacrifice, a calculated gamble to buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses. Leonidas and his men had come here to die, and their very willingness to embrace death made them more dangerous than any army that fought for victory. As night fell over the bloody pass, Persian campfires stretched across the plain like fallen stars. The army that had seemed invincible just days before was learning a harsh lesson about the difference between conquering subjects and fighting free men. Subjects fought because they had to. Free men fought because they chose to. And men who chose to die for their ideals were the most dangerous enemies any tyrant could face. In the Greek camp, the mood was cautiously optimistic despite the day's losses. They had proven that the Persian army could be stopped, that the supposedly invincible force that had terrorized half the world was made up of mortal men who bled and died like any others. But they also knew that time was running out. Xerxes had reserves that seemed endless, while every Greek casualty was irreplaceable. They could win a dozen battles like this and still face inevitable defeat. The hot gates fell silent at last, but their echoes would thunder across eternity. Leonidas and his 300 had bought Greece the time it desperately needed, and that time would prove more precious than all the gold in Xerxes' treasury. At Salamis, the Greek fleet would shatter Persian naval power. At Plataea, their armies would break the empire's land forces forever. The sacrifice at Thermopylae had lit a fire that would burn the greatest empire on earth to ash. Sometimes, the most powerful victories come not from those who live to celebrate them, but from those who die to make them possible. In the blazing heat of a Greek summer morning in 480 BCE, the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae. Picture this: the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever assembled, stretching beyond the horizon like a dark sea of bronze and steel, bearing down on a handful of Greek warriors who refused to step aside. This wasn't just another border skirmish or territorial dispute. This was the moment when the fate of Western civilization itself hung by a thread, decided by men who chose to stand firm when retreat seemed the only rational choice. The story you think you know about 300 Spartans might be legendary, but the real events at Thermopylae were far more complex, far more strategic, and ultimately far more consequential than any Hollywood epic could capture. What unfolded over 3 scorching days in that narrow pass wasn't just military genius meeting impossible odds. It was the collision of 2 worlds, 2 philosophies, and 2 very different ideas about what it meant to be free. But before we witness that epic clash, we need to understand how the ancient world arrived at this pivotal moment. The seeds of Thermopylae were planted decades earlier, in the marble halls of Persian palaces and the dusty agoras of Greek city-states, where decisions made by kings and citizens alike set the stage for one of history's most consequential battles. The Persian Empire in 480 BCE was unlike anything the world had seen. Stretching from the banks of the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea, from the scorching deserts of Egypt to the mountain ranges of Central Asia, it was a colossus that dwarfed every other power on earth. Under the rule of Xerxes I, this empire controlled the lives of millions, commanded resources beyond imagination, and possessed military might that seemed unstoppable. The Persian king didn't merely rule territories, he commanded civilizations, each with their own gods, languages, and traditions, all bound together under the authority of the great king. To understand Xerxes' burning desire to conquer Greece, we must journey back 10 years earlier to a humiliating defeat that haunted the Persian royal house. In 490 BCE, his father Darius the Great had dispatched an expedition across the Aegean to punish 2 insignificant Greek cities, Athens and Eretria, for daring to support a rebellion in the Persian-controlled territories of Asia Minor. The mission seemed routine, almost beneath the notice of the great empire. After all, what could these fractured Greek city-states possibly do against Persian might? The answer came thundering across the plains of Marathon, where a smaller Athenian force achieved the impossible, crushing the Persian expedition and sending its survivors limping back across the sea. For Persia, this wasn't just a military setback. It was a wound to imperial pride that festered for a decade. Darius swore vengeance, but death claimed him before he could march. That oath of retribution passed to his son Xerxes, a king whose ambition matched his empire's vast scope. Xerxes would not repeat his father's mistake of sending a mere expedition. He would come himself, at the head of an army so massive that ancient chroniclers claimed it drank rivers dry on its march. This would be no punitive raid but total conquest, the final act in Persia's westward expansion that would bring all of Europe under the shadow of the Persian throne. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, Greece presented a picture of chaotic disunity that should have made Persian conquest inevitable. Over 1,000 independent city-states dotted the Greek mainland and islands, each fiercely protective of its autonomy, each with its own government, army, and often conflicting ambitions. Athens and Sparta, the 2 most powerful, were as different as fire and ice. Athens thrummed with the energy of democracy, its agora filled with merchants, philosophers, and citizens debating everything from trade policy to the nature of justice. It was a naval power, its strength measured in swift triremes and the skill of free citizens who chose to serve. Sparta, by contrast, was a society built entirely around war. Here, boys were taken from their families at age 7 and molded into professional soldiers through a brutal training system called the agoge. Every aspect of Spartan life revolved around military excellence, discipline, and the unwavering belief that death in battle for one's homeland was the highest honor a man could achieve. Where Athens celebrated individual achievement and democratic ideals, Sparta worshipped collective strength and unquestioning obedience to the state. For centuries, these Greek city-states had spent as much time fighting each other as they had trading or forming alliances. Unity seemed impossible, a dream as distant as the Persian heartland. But the shadow of Xerxes' approaching army accomplished what decades of diplomacy could not. In 481 BCE, representatives from dozens of city-states gathered at the Isthmus of Corinth for an unprecedented meeting. There, setting aside ancient rivalries and mutual suspicions, they formed the Hellenic League, a defensive pact against the Persian threat. The strategy they devised was brilliant in its simplicity. Greece's mountainous terrain and narrow coastal passes could neutralize Persia's overwhelming numerical advantage. Instead of meeting the invaders in open battle where numbers would decide the outcome, the Greeks would use geography as their ally. They would force the Persians to fight on ground that favored defenders, where a smaller force could hold off a much larger army. The chosen battleground was Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a narrow pass between towering mountains and the sea. Here, even the largest army in the world would be funneled into a space so constricted that only a few hundred men could fight at once. The very name of the place came from the sulfur springs that bubbled up from the earth, filling the air with the smell of the underworld. It was as if the gods themselves had designed this spot for a last stand. Back in the Persian heartland, preparations for invasion reached a scale that defied comprehension. Herodotus, the father of history, claimed that Xerxes assembled over 1 million fighting men, though modern historians estimate the real number closer to 200,000, still vast by ancient standards. This army was the empire itself in motion. Persian immortals marched alongside Assyrian archers, Babylonian spearmen beside Indian cavalry, Egyptian marines next to warriors from the steppes of Central Asia. It was not just an invasion force, but a demonstration of imperial might, designed to break the will of any who dared resist. To transport this massive host across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, Persian engineers constructed 2 colossal pontoon bridges. Hundreds of ships were lashed together with cables and covered with planks and earth, creating a roadway across the water. When storms destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes, in a display of royal fury that became legendary, ordered the sea itself whipped for its disobedience before commanding his engineers to try again. The second bridges held, and for days the Persian army poured across into Europe like a human tide. Dust clouds rose to the heavens as countless feet trampled the roads of Thrace and Macedonia. Cities that resisted were razed to the ground, their populations enslaved or slaughtered. Those that submitted were spared, but forced to provide supplies and reinforcements for the advancing host. As this avalanche of men and steel rolled south toward Greece, panic spread ahead of it like wildfire. Many Greek city-states north of Thessaly took one look at the approaching army and immediately offered submission. Who could blame them? The sight of Xerxes' host must have seemed like witnessing a force of nature, unstoppable and overwhelming as an earthquake or tsunami. Yet in the southern reaches of Greece, a very different response was taking shape. The Hellenic League had made their choice, and there would be no submission, no negotiation, no bending the knee to Persian might. The Greeks would fight, even if it meant facing annihilation. The decision fell to Sparta to lead the land defense, while Athens would command the allied fleet. It was a partnership born of necessity, 2 rival powers setting aside their differences to face an existential threat. King Leonidas of Sparta faced an impossible situation. The full Spartan army could not march immediately due to the Cannae, a sacred religious festival that forbade warfare until its completion. But the Persian advance would not wait for Spartan religious observances. Every day of delay meant more Greek cities falling under Persian control, more resources flowing to Xerxes, and less time to organize an effective defense. The situation demanded immediate action, but Spartan law demanded patience. Leonidas chose a middle path that would define his legacy. He would take his personal bodyguard, 300 of Sparta's elite warriors, chosen not just for their skill, but for a crucial qualification that revealed the grim reality of their mission. Each man had living sons to carry on their bloodline. This was not the selection criteria for a campaign they expected to survive. These were men chosen to die, selected for a suicide mission disguised as a military deployment. The 300 Spartans would not stand alone, though their presence would dominate the story for millennia to come. 700 Thespians volunteered to join them, knowing full well the likely outcome. 400 Thebans were compelled to participate, their loyalty questionable but their bodies needed for the line. Contingents from Phocis, Locris, and other allied cities swelled the total Greek force to approximately 7,000 men. It was still a pitifully small number compared to the Persian host, but in the narrow confines of Thermopylae, numbers would matter less than discipline, training, and sheer determination. As the Greek force marched north through the rugged countryside, villages emptied to watch them pass. Word spread like wildfire through the towns and farms. The Spartans are marching to the hot gates. The king himself leads them. Children climbed walls and rooftops to catch a glimpse of the legendary warriors, their bronze armor gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, their red cloaks flowing behind them like rivers of blood. The march itself was a statement of defiance that echoed across Greece. If Sparta was willing to send her king to the front lines with only his personal guard, then the cause was worth the ultimate sacrifice. Villages that had wavered in their allegiance suddenly found their courage. Men grabbed spears and shields to join the column, farmers abandoned their fields, and artisans left their workshops. The march to Thermopylae became a rallying cry for all of Greece. When Leonidas and his men finally reached the pass, they found exactly what they had hoped for. Thermopylae was a defender's dream, a geographical bottleneck where the advantages of numbers, cavalry, and massed archery would be neutralized. The pass was so narrow that in some places only a single chariot could squeeze through. On one side, steep mountains rose like a wall to the heavens. On the other, the sea crashed against rocky shores, creating a corridor of death where the Persian multitudes would be compressed into a killing ground. The Greeks immediately set to work improving their position. They rebuilt and strengthened an old Phocian wall that blocked the narrowest part of the pass, creating a barrier behind which they could fight with maximum advantage. Stones were gathered, timber cut, and defensive positions prepared with the methodical efficiency that marked professional soldiers. Every hour of preparation could mean the difference between holding the line for 1 day or 3. From their position, the defenders could see the dust clouds on the northern horizon growing larger each day. The Persian army was approaching, a moving city of warriors, horses, and camp followers that stretched beyond sight. At night, the glow of their countless campfires painted the northern sky orange, as if the very earth was burning. The smell of smoke and dust carried on the wind, bringing with it the promise of battle. Xerxes himself traveled in unprecedented luxury, his royal pavilion a palace of silk and gold that housed not just the great king, but an entire court of nobles, advisors, and servants. This mobile capital rivaled the greatest cities of the ancient world in its splendor, a deliberate display of power meant to intimidate enemies and impress subjects. The Persian king dined on delicacies from across his empire while his soldiers prepared for battle. The contrast between royal comfort and military necessity stark even by ancient standards. When the Persian vanguard finally appeared at the northern mouth of Thermopylae, the sight must have been both terrifying and magnificent. Unit after unit marched into view, their weapons and armor creating a sea of bronze and iron that seemed to stretch to infinity. Banners of every province in the empire fluttered in the breeze, while the rumble of marching feet, creaking wagon wheels, and stamping horses filled the air with the sound of approaching doom. The Greeks watched this display of imperial might with grim satisfaction. Let the Persians come with their hundreds of thousands. Here in this narrow place, those numbers would become a liability rather than an advantage. The very size of Xerxes' army would work against him, creating confusion, limiting maneuverability, and preventing the coordinated attacks that had brought down so many enemies in open battle. For 3 days, Xerxes waited. Perhaps he expected the Greeks to lose their nerve at the sight of his massive army. Perhaps he hoped they would negotiate, offering submission in exchange for their lives. The Persian king had conquered much of his empire through intimidation rather than battle, and the psychological impact of his assembled host had broken the will of stronger opponents than these Greeks. But the defenders at Thermopylae showed no signs of wavering. If anything, they seemed to grow more confident as the hours passed. Finally, Xerxes sent heralds to demand the Greeks' surrender. The terms were generous by Persian standards. Lay down your arms, accept Persian rule, and live. Continue to resist and face annihilation. The message was delivered with the formal courtesy that marked Persian diplomacy, but the threat was unmistakable. This was their last chance to avoid destruction. Leonidas's response became the stuff of legend. When the Persian herald demanded that the Greeks surrender their weapons, the Spartan king replied with 2 words that would echo through history: "Come and take them." It was not just defiance, but an invitation, a challenge thrown in the face of the mightiest empire on earth. The die was cast. There would be no surrender, no negotiation, no retreat. The hot gates would live up to their name. The morning of the first assault dawned with an eerie stillness that seemed to mock the violence about to unfold. Across the narrow pass, the Persian host stirred like a great beast awakening, the clatter of bronze and leather mixing with the harsh commands of officers, preparing their men for what should have been a routine slaughter. Xerxes had positioned his golden throne on a hill, overlooking the battlefield, expecting to watch his enemies swept away like leaves before a hurricane. The great king's confidence was absolute. After all, what could a few thousand Greeks accomplish against the might of an empire that had never known defeat? The first wave came at dawn. Median and Sacian infantry advancing in disciplined ranks, their wicker shields catching the early light, their war cries echoing between the cliffs. These were seasoned warriors from the heart of the Persian Empire, men who had fought in a dozen campaigns and conquered cities from Babylon to the Indus. They moved forward with the steady confidence of soldiers who had never tasted defeat, expecting to crush the Greek line in a matter of minutes. But the moment they entered the killing ground of Thermopylae, everything changed. The narrow pass transformed Xerxes' advantage into a catastrophic weakness. Where thousands should have been able to advance, only a few dozen could fight at once. The Persian formations, designed for open battle, crumbled against the Greek phalanx like waves against a seawall. The Greek hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder behind their bronze shields, each overlapping the next to create an impenetrable wall of metal. From behind this barrier, 18-foot spears thrust forward in perfect unison, creating a forest of death that no enemy could penetrate. The Persians, armed with shorter weapons and lighter armor, found themselves at a fatal disadvantage. Their wicker shields splintered under the impact of Greek spear points. Their shorter spears couldn't reach the defenders, and their light armor offered little protection against the disciplined thrust of the phalanx. For hours the battle raged, wave after wave of Persian infantry hurling themselves against the Greek line, only to be cut down or driven back. The narrow ground became slick with blood, bodies piling up so high that the living had to clamber over the dead to reach their enemies. The Greeks rotated fresh men to the front in shifts, a tactical innovation that kept their line strong, while the Persians exhausted themselves in futile attacks. By midday, Xerxes' frustration had turned to rage. This should have been over in an hour, yet his elite troops were being butchered by a handful of Greeks in a glorified ditch. The great king ordered forward his most feared warriors, the Immortals, 10,000 strong, and the pride of the Persian army. Surely these legendary soldiers, who had never failed in battle, would break the stubborn Greek resistance. The 3 days at Thermopylae proved that courage and strategy could indeed halt the unstoppable. Though Leonidas and his men fell, their sacrifice bought Greece the precious time it needed to regroup and ultimately triumph. At Salamis and Plataea, the hot gates became more than a battlefield. They became a symbol that echoes through history, reminding us that sometimes standing firm against impossible odds is the only choice that truly matters. Picture this. It's 480 BCE, and the fate of Western civilization hangs by a thread at a narrow mountain pass in Greece. 300 Spartans and their allies stand against the mightiest empire the world has ever seen. We all know how this story ends. Leonidas falls, the pass is taken, and the Persians march south. But what if it hadn't happened that way? What if those bronze shields had held firm, those spears had never broken, and Xerxes had been forced to retreat in shame? Today, we're diving into one of history's most fascinating what-ifs, a scenario where the hot gates never fell, and how that single change could have rewritten the entire story of human civilization. The summer of 480 BCE was unlike any other in the ancient world. Across the Hellespont, the greatest military machine ever assembled was on the move. King Xerxes of Persia had spent years preparing for this moment. The humiliation his father Darius had suffered at Marathon still burned in the royal memory, and now the time for revenge had come. This wasn't just another campaign. This was the culmination of Persian imperial ambition, a carefully orchestrated invasion designed to bring all of Greece under the Persian yoke once and for all. The numbers were staggering. Ancient sources speak of millions of soldiers, though modern historians estimate the Persian force at somewhere between 120,000 and 300,000 men. Either way, it was a host unlike anything the Greek world had ever faced. Immortals from Persia, archers from Syria, cavalry from Bactria, marines from Phoenicia. The empire itself was marching west, a living tide of bronze and steel that seemed unstoppable. Supply depots had been established across the route. Massive pontoon bridges spanned the Hellespont. Even a canal had been dug through the Athos Peninsula to allow the Persian fleet safe passage. Nothing had been left to chance. Against this overwhelming force stood the fractured, quarreling city-states of Greece. Athens and Sparta, the two great powers, were natural rivals who could barely agree on the time of day, let alone coordinate a defense. The smaller states watched nervously from the sidelines, many already calculating which way the wind was blowing. Some, like Thebes, had already thrown in their lot with the Persians. Others sent token forces while keeping their main armies at home. It seemed impossible that such a divided coalition could stand against the unified might of the Persian Empire. Yet the Greeks had something the Persians lacked. They knew their own ground. When the Persian host finally reached the borders of central Greece, they found their path blocked by a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. Here, between towering cliffs and the restless sea, the road south narrowed to barely the width of a cart track. It was the perfect defensive position, a place where a few disciplined warriors could hold off an army many times their size. King Leonidas of Sparta understood this immediately. While his compatriots celebrated religious festivals that prevented them from marching in full force, he gathered his personal guard of 300 picked men. These weren't young recruits fresh from training. They were veterans, fathers with sons to carry on their bloodlines, men who knew this mission would likely end in death. Alongside them came allies from across Greece, 700 Thespians who volunteered to stay to the end, 400 Thebans whose loyalty was suspect, but whose presence was required, contingents from a dozen smaller cities, bringing the total Greek force to around 7,000 men. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side, the greatest empire in the world, its banners stretching to the horizon, its supply trains rumbling with the wealth of a dozen nations. On the other, a small band of Greeks standing in a narrow pass, their bronze armor glinting in the morning sun, their long spears forming an impenetrable hedge of death. But what made this moment so crucial wasn't just the military reality. It was what each side represented. The Persian Empire, for all its might and grandeur, was fundamentally different from the Greek world. It was a top-down hierarchy where power flowed from the god-king Xerxes down through layers of satraps and governors to the common soldiers. Individual initiative was discouraged. Conformity was prized. The empire's strength lay in its ability to mobilize vast resources and coordinate the efforts of dozens of different peoples under a single will. Greece was chaos by comparison. Each city-state jealously guarded its independence. Citizens argued in assemblies, voted on laws, and questioned their leaders. Athens was experimenting with something called democracy, where even common farmers could have a say in government. Sparta had created a warrior society, unlike anything the world had ever seen, where discipline and honor were valued above life itself. These weren't subjects bowing before a throne. These were free men fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. The clash at Thermopylae was therefore much more than a battle between two armies. It was a collision between two fundamentally different visions of how human society should be organized. Would the future belong to imperial unity and centralized control, or to the messy, chaotic but vibrant world of independent city-states? Would humanity's destiny be shaped by the commands of god-kings, or by the voices of citizens debating in the marketplace? When the first Persian attacks began, the answer seemed obvious. How could 7,000 Greeks, no matter how brave or disciplined, stand against the endless waves of Persian soldiers? The Medes came first, confident in their numbers and their reputation. They crashed against the Greek line like waves against a cliff, their wicker shields splintering on bronze, their short spears unable to reach past the forest of Greek spear points. Behind them came the Immortals, Xerxes' elite guard. 10,000 strong and supposedly invincible, they too were thrown back, their formation breaking apart in the narrow confines of the pass. For 2 days, the pattern repeated. Wave after wave of Persian attacks met the unmovable wall of Greek bronze and iron. The pass became a charnel house, littered with Persian dead, while the Greek line held firm. Xerxes watched from his golden throne, leaping to his feet in rage as his best troops were repelled by a handful of Greeks. The impossible was happening. The unstoppable Persian war machine had been stopped cold, but then came the betrayal that would seal the fate of the 300. A local Greek named Ephialtes, seeking Persian gold, revealed the existence of a goat path through the mountains that would allow the Persians to attack the Greeks from behind. As dawn broke on the third day, Leonidas realized the trap was closing. The immortals were descending from the mountain path, while the main Persian force prepared for another frontal assault. The Greeks were about to be caught in a vice from which there could be no escape. This was the moment that would echo through eternity. In our timeline, Leonidas made the fateful decision that would immortalize him in legend. He dismissed most of his allies, keeping only his 300 Spartans and a handful of volunteers for a last stand that would buy precious time for the Greek fleet to escape. The final battle was brief and brutal. Surrounded and outnumbered, the defenders fought to the last man, selling their lives dearly but ultimately falling beneath a storm of Persian arrows. But what if that mountain path had never been revealed? What if Ephialtes had remained loyal, or had been discovered before he could reach the Persian camp? What if the 300 had held not for 3 days, but for 3 weeks or 3 months? The ripple effects of such a change would have been staggering, reshaping not just the ancient world, but the entire course of human history. Picture the scene if that betrayal had never come. The third dawn breaks over Thermopylae, and instead of being surrounded, the Greek line still holds firm. Xerxes, watching from his throne, faces a reality no Persian king had ever confronted. His supposedly invincible army, the terror of nations, has been stopped dead by a few thousand Greeks in bronze armor. The implications would have been immediate and catastrophic for the Persian war machine. You see, the Persian Empire wasn't just fighting a military campaign, it was fighting time itself. That massive army, with its hundreds of thousands of soldiers and camp followers, was a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. Every day they remained in one place. They consumed tons of supplies: grain, meat, water, fodder for the horses and pack animals. The longer they stayed at Thermopylae, battering uselessly against that unbreakable Greek wall, the more their supply lines stretched and strained. The Persian fleet, shadowing the army along the coast, faced its own mounting problems. The narrow waters around Artemisium had already cost them dearly in storms and skirmishes with the Greek navy. Now, with the army stalled indefinitely at the hot gates, the fleet found itself trapped in hostile waters with no clear mission. Should they attempt to force a landing south of the pass, risk everything on a desperate assault against prepared Greek positions, the Persian admirals, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies through sheer numbers, suddenly found themselves in an impossible strategic bind. But the real crisis wasn't tactical, it was psychological. Throughout the Persian Empire, from the dusty roads of Mesopotamia to the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, the word spread like wildfire. The great king's army had been stopped, not defeated in some grand battle where they could claim the enemy had superior numbers or better ground, stopped cold by a handful of Greeks who refused to bow down. For an empire built on the myth of Persian invincibility, this was more dangerous than losing a dozen battles. Back in Greece, the news would have electrified the wavering city-states. Those who had been calculating the odds, wondering whether to resist or submit, suddenly saw a different possibility. If 300 Spartans could hold off the entire Persian army, what could all of Greece accomplish united? The psychological impact would have been enormous. Cities that had already sent earth and water to Xerxes as tokens of submission might have reconsidered. Neutral states might have thrown their weight behind the Greek cause. Even some of those fighting for Persia might have begun to question their choice. Imagine Xerxes facing this impossible situation. Every day at Thermopylae cost him not just supplies and men, but prestige and authority. Back home in Persepolis, his satraps would be receiving reports of the stalemate with growing concern. Revolts that had been simmering beneath the surface might suddenly flare into open rebellion. Egypt, always restless under Persian rule, might see this as the moment to strike for independence. The Greek cities of Ionia, conquered by his father, might rise in coordinated revolt. The great king would have faced an agonizing choice: retreat and admit that the mighty Persian Empire could be stymied by a few thousand Greeks, continue the assault, and watch his army bleed away in futile attacks against an impregnable position, or try to find another way around, burning precious weeks while his empire began to fracture behind him. But let's say Xerxes chose to withdraw. The humiliation would have been absolute. The army that had crossed the Hellespont in triumph would now be retreating with its tail between its legs, pursued not by a victorious enemy army, but by its own failure. The retreat itself would have been a catastrophe. Hungry, demoralized troops struggling back across hostile territory, while local populations, emboldened by Persian weakness, harassed their columns and cut off stragglers. The psychological shockwaves would have reverberated across the ancient world. In Egypt, the old pharaonic families would have seen their chance to throw off the Persian yoke. In Babylon, the ancient priesthoods would have whispered that the gods had turned against the Persians. From India to the Black Sea, subject peoples would have looked at their Persian overseers with new eyes. The empire that had seemed eternal and unshakable would suddenly appear vulnerable, mortal, defeatable. In Greece itself, the implications would have been even more profound. A successful defense of Thermopylae wouldn't just have saved the southern city-states from invasion, it would have fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Greek world. Sparta, already respected for its military prowess, would have achieved a reputation bordering on the supernatural. The 300 who held the pass would have become living legends, proof that Spartan discipline and courage could overcome any odds. But here's where it gets really interesting. In our timeline, the Greek victory at Salamis and Plataea came at enormous cost. Athens was burned, thousands died, and the Greek world was left economically devastated. A victory at Thermopylae would have prevented all of that. The Greek cities would have been preserved intact, their populations unscathed, their treasuries unplundered. Instead of spending the next decade rebuilding from ruins, they could have used that time and energy to expand their influence. Picture an Athens that never burned, the Acropolis intact, the Agora bustling with merchants from across the Mediterranean. Pericles wouldn't have needed to rebuild the city. He could have devoted his energies to expanding Athenian power and influence. The resources that went into reconstruction could have funded new colonies, new trade routes, new alliances. The golden age of Athens might have begun decades earlier and burned far brighter. The ripple effects would have spread far beyond Greece itself. With Persia humbled and in retreat, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean would have shifted dramatically. Greek merchants and colonists, no longer fearing Persian interference, might have pushed further east than ever before. Greek ideas about politics, philosophy, and science might have spread into regions that remained closed to them in our timeline. Consider the intellectual implications. The confidence boost from repelling the Persian invasion might have accelerated Greek philosophical and scientific development. Without the trauma of occupation and destruction, Greek thinkers might have felt freer to explore radical new ideas. The democratic experiment in Athens might have evolved faster and more boldly. Other city-states, inspired by Athens' success and Sparta's military glory, might have developed their own innovations in governance and society. The economic consequences would have been equally dramatic. Greece in 479 BCE would have been far wealthier and more populous than the Greece that actually emerged from the Persian Wars. This prosperity would have funded larger armies, bigger fleets, more ambitious building projects. The Parthenon might have had company from other architectural marvels that were never built because the resources went to war instead. But perhaps most intriguingly, a Persian defeat at Thermopylae might have prevented the internal conflicts that would later tear Greece apart. In our timeline, the success against Persia eventually led to Athenian dominance and the creation of the Delian League, which in turn sparked Spartan fear and resentment. The result was the devastating Peloponnesian War that left both superpowers exhausted and vulnerable. If Thermopylae had never fallen, that cycle of success, domination, and internal strife might never have begun. With Persia decisively repelled, and both Athens and Sparta sharing in the glory of victory, the two powers might have found common cause in exploiting their unexpected triumph. Rather than competing for leadership of Greece, they might have cooperated in expanding Greek influence eastward into the power vacuum left by Persian retreat. Think about what this would have meant for the development of Greek culture. In our timeline, the greatest achievements of classical Greece came during brief periods of peace between devastating wars. The golden age of Athens flourished in the decades after the Persian defeat, but was cut short by the Peloponnesian conflict. Imagine if that golden age had lasted not decades but centuries. If the resources spent on fratricidal warfare had instead gone toward philosophy, art, science, and exploration, the great schools of Athens would have had uninterrupted generations to develop their ideas. Socrates might not have been executed by a city traumatized by military defeat and political upheaval. Plato's academy could have flourished without the disruption of constant warfare. Aristotle might have had access to far more extensive libraries and research materials, perhaps accelerating scientific discovery by centuries, but the implications stretch far beyond the borders of Greece itself. A triumphant, unified Greek world would have fundamentally altered the trajectory of Mediterranean civilization. In our timeline, the Greek city-states eventually fell to the rising power of Rome, exhausted by their internal conflicts and unable to present a united front. But a Greece that had never been weakened by civil war, that had grown rich and powerful through decades of unopposed expansion, would have been a very different opponent for Roman ambitions. Picture Roman legions marching north, expecting to find the familiar patchwork of quarreling Greek cities, only to encounter a confederated Greek world with professional armies, abundant resources, and a well-deserved reputation for military excellence. The Romans were masters of divide and conquer, turning Greek states against each other to achieve victory. Against a united Greece flushed with victory over the Persian Empire, those tactics would have been useless. The Romans might never have expanded beyond Italy, or if they had, they might have been forced to develop as partners rather than conquerors, trading and negotiating with Greek powers rather than absorbing them. The entire character of what we call classical civilization might have been fundamentally different, shaped more by Greek democratic ideals than Roman imperial efficiency. This alternate path becomes even more intriguing when we consider the religious implications. In our timeline, the rise of Christianity occurred within the context of Roman political and cultural dominance. Greek philosophical ideas provided the intellectual framework, but Roman administrative systems and legal concepts shaped how the new faith spread and organized itself. Without Roman dominance, Christianity might have developed along very different lines, or might not have emerged at all in its familiar form. The Persian defeat at Thermopylae might have triggered a cascade of religious and cultural changes throughout the ancient world. Zoroastrianism, the official religion of the Persian Empire, would have suffered a devastating blow to its prestige and influence. Local religious traditions, suppressed by Persian rule, might have experienced a revival. Greek religious and philosophical ideas, carrying the prestige of military victory, might have spread much further east than they actually did. Consider the fate of the Persian Empire itself in this scenario. A decisive defeat at Thermopylae wouldn't have just ended the Greek campaign. It would have shattered the fundamental basis of Persian imperial ideology. The Persian system was built on the concept of the great king as the chosen representative of Ahura Mazda, destined to rule all peoples and bring order to the world. A humiliating retreat from Greece would have called that entire worldview into question. The empire might have fragmented within decades rather than centuries. Egypt would almost certainly have rebelled, probably successfully. The eastern satrapies might have declared independence. Babylon might have attempted to restore its ancient autonomy. What had been the world's largest unified state might have split into a dozen competing kingdoms, each trying to claim legitimacy while lacking the overwhelming military power that had held the empire together. This fragmentation would have created opportunities for Greek expansion that never existed in our timeline. Greek mercenaries, traders, and colonists might have moved into former Persian territories not as subjects or reluctant allies, but as representatives of the civilization that had brought the mighty empire low. Greek cities might have been founded as far east as India, spreading Hellenic culture and political ideas across vast distances. The economic implications alone would have reshaped the ancient world. Persian control of trade routes between east and west had given the empire enormous wealth and leverage. With that control broken, Greek merchants might have established direct trading relationships with India and Central Asia. The wealth flowing into Greek cities would have funded even more ambitious projects of expansion and cultural development. But perhaps the most profound change would have been psychological and cultural. The Persian Empire represented something that was disappearing from the world by 480 BCE. It was the last of the great Bronze Age empires, built on concepts of divine kingship and absolute authority that stretched back to the earliest civilizations. Its defeat at Thermopylae would have marked not just a military victory, but the triumph of newer ideas about human organization and potential. Greek concepts of citizenship, political participation, and individual excellence would have spread without the interruption of Persian conquest or Roman absorption. The idea that ordinary people could participate in their own governance, that merit rather than birth should determine advancement, that human reason could understand and improve the world, these revolutionary concepts might have taken root across a much wider area much earlier in history. The ripple effects would have reached far beyond the Mediterranean. Trade routes that carried Greek goods and ideas might have extended the influence of Hellenic civilization deep into Africa and Asia. Greek mathematical and scientific knowledge, developing without the interruption of constant warfare, might have produced technological advances that could have accelerated human progress by centuries. Consider what this might have meant for the development of science and philosophy. Greek natural philosophers were already beginning to move away from purely mythological explanations of natural phenomena toward more systematic observation and reasoning. With greater resources, more stable political conditions, and contact with a wider range of cultures and ideas, this scientific revolution might have proceeded much more rapidly. Archimedes might have had access to Indian mathematical concepts centuries earlier than he actually did. Greek astronomers might have been able to establish observatories from Spain to India, dramatically improving their understanding of celestial mechanics. Greek physicians might have had access to medical traditions from across the known world, accelerating the development of medical knowledge and practice. The technological implications are staggering to contemplate. Steam power might have been developed in Alexandria rather than 18th century England. Precision navigation instruments might have enabled Greek explorers to reach the Americas long before Columbus. The printing press might have emerged from Greek scriptoriums rather than German workshops. But technology is only as powerful as the social and political systems that deploy it. Here, too, a world shaped by triumphant Greek ideals rather than Roman imperial efficiency might have developed along radically different lines. The Roman genius lay in administration, in creating systems that could govern vast territories with reasonable efficiency and stability. Greek genius lay in innovation, in questioning established assumptions and exploring new possibilities. A world dominated by Greek rather than Roman civilization might have been less politically stable but far more intellectually dynamic. Instead of the Roman preference for preserving and systematizing existing knowledge, we might have seen a culture that prized discovery and experimentation above all else. The result might have been a civilization that advanced much more rapidly in science and technology while remaining more politically fragmented and competitive. This fragmentation might actually have been beneficial for human progress. Competition between Greek city-states and their colonial offspring might have driven innovation in ways that the unified Roman system never could. Each city would have had incentives to develop new technologies, new forms of organization, new approaches to old problems, in order to maintain its independence and prosperity against its rivals. The military implications of this alternate timeline become particularly fascinating when we consider what might have happened when this dynamic Greek civilization encountered other expanding powers. In our timeline, Greek military innovations like the phalanx and siege engines eventually spread throughout the Mediterranean world. In a timeline where Greek civilization had centuries more to develop without Roman interference, the military technologies and tactics available to Greek armies might have been far more advanced. By the time Greek expansion brought them into contact with emerging powers like the Parthians, the Germans, or the Chinese, they might have possessed decisive technological advantages. Greek fire might have been perfected centuries earlier. Greek metallurgy might have produced steel weapons and armor of unprecedented quality. Greek siege engines might have been capable of reducing any fortress. But perhaps more importantly, the Greek approach to warfare itself might have evolved in revolutionary directions. The citizen-soldier ideal, where free men fought for their own communities rather than serving as subjects of distant rulers, might have produced military forces with morale and effectiveness far exceeding anything seen in our timeline. So there you have it. One betrayal, one mountain path, one moment of weakness that changed everything. If Ephialtes had never revealed that goat trail, if those bronze shields had held firm for just a few more days, the world we know today might be unrecognizable. Democracy might have spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific centuries earlier. Science and philosophy might have advanced at breakneck speed. The very concept of individual liberty might have taken root across the globe long before the age of empires. But here's the thing about history. It's not just a collection of what-ifs and might-have-beens. It's a reminder that every moment, every decision, every act of courage or cowardice echoes through time in ways we can barely imagine. Those 300 Spartans didn't just fight for Greece. They fought for an idea, the radical notion that free people standing together could face down any tyranny. That idea survived their defeat. It lived on through Athens and Rome, through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, right down to the world we inhabit today. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the noblest defeats. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's worth asking what might have been if things had gone differently at a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea. In the scorching heat of a Persian summer, on a dusty plain near the ancient city of Gaugamela, the fate of civilization itself hung in the balance. Two armies faced each other across the shimmering desert, their banners snapping in the wind like the wings of predatory birds. On one side stood the greatest empire the world had ever known, its ranks stretching beyond the horizon, a sea of glinting bronze and steel that seemed to swallow the very earth. On the other stood a young Macedonian king, barely 25 years old, with an army so outnumbered that victory seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. What happened next would shatter the ancient world like glass, sending shockwaves across 3 continents that are still felt today. This wasn't just another battle. This was the moment when the unstoppable force of Persian might met the immovable object of Macedonian genius, and the collision would rewrite history itself. The year was 331 BCE, and Alexander the Great was about to prove that sometimes the most shocking victories come not from overwhelming force, but from the audacity to attempt the impossible. To understand the magnitude of what Alexander achieved at Gaugamela, you have to grasp just how desperate his situation had become. He was thousands of miles from home, deep in enemy territory, with supply lines stretched thinner than spider silk. Behind him lay a trail of conquered cities, but ahead loomed the full fury of the Persian Empire, awakened at last from its Darius Theumber. King III had finally decided to crush this upstart Macedonian once and for all, and he brought with him an army that defied comprehension. Ancient sources speak of numbers that border on the mythical. Some claimed Darius commanded over 1 million men, though modern historians place the figure closer to 250,000. Even at the conservative estimate, Alexander faced odds of nearly 5 to 1. The Persian host was a tapestry woven from the far corners of the known world. Scythian horse archers from the steppes, their bows singing death songs across the plains. Bactrian cavalry in scale armor that caught the sun like dragon skin. Indian war elephants, living siege engines that could trample entire formations underfoot. Greek mercenaries, ironically fighting against the very homeland that had birthed them. At the center of this magnificent terror stood Darius himself, resplendent in his golden chariot, surrounded by the immortals, the elite guard whose ranks were always kept at exactly 10,000 strong. These were not mere soldiers, but the embodiment of Persian power, warriors who had never known defeat, who served an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. Against this overwhelming tide stood Alexander's army of perhaps 50,000 souls. They were battle-hardened veterans, certainly men who had followed their king from the shores of Macedonia to the heart of Asia. But they were still just men, flesh and blood, far from home and facing annihilation. The smart play would have been retreat, negotiation, perhaps even surrender. Darius had already offered Alexander terms that would make him one of the richest men alive, recognition as an equal, and all the territory he had already conquered. But Alexander wasn't interested in being smart. He was interested in being legendary. The Macedonian king had not arrived at this moment by accident. His path to Gaugamela had been carved through two previous victories that had already shaken the foundations of the Persian Empire. The first had come at the Granicus River, where Alexander had announced his presence in Asia with typical flair, charging across a defended river, crossing in a move so reckless it bordered on suicidal. The Persian satraps, regional governors who ruled like kings in their own right, had gathered to crush this invasion before it could take root. They chose their ground well, positioning their forces on the far bank of the steep-sided Granicus, turning the river into a moat that should have been impassable. Alexander looked at this natural fortress and saw not an obstacle but an opportunity. While his generals urged caution, the young king spurred his horse forward, plunging into the churning waters at the head of his elite companion cavalry. What followed was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. The Persians, expecting a cautious approach, were caught off guard by the sheer audacity of a frontal assault. Alexander himself was nearly killed in the melee, his helmet split by a Persian axe, saved only by the timely intervention of his bodyguard. But the shock of his personal charge shattered the Persian line like a hammer blow to crystal. The victory at Granicus was more than tactical. It was psychological. Alexander had proven that Persian forces could be beaten, that the empire's reputation for invincibility was built on sand. Cities across Asia Minor threw open their gates rather than face the wrath of this young conqueror. The Persian treasury began to bleed gold as tribute flowed into Macedonian coffers, funding an invasion that had started on borrowed money and desperate hopes. But if Granicus was Alexander's announcement, the Battle of Issus was his declaration of war against the very concept of Persian supremacy. Darius himself had taken the field this time, marching north with an army that dwarfed anything Alexander had yet faced. The Persian king was no fool. He had learned from the disaster at Granicus and chose his ground carefully, seeking to use his numerical advantage to surround and destroy the Macedonian force. Yet in trying to outmaneuver Alexander, Darius made a crucial error. He positioned his vast army in the narrow coastal plain near Issus, where his superior numbers became a liability rather than an asset. The mountains hemmed him in on one side, the sea on the other, creating a battlefield where only a fraction of his forces could engage at any given time. It was like trying to pour an ocean through a funnel. Alexander recognized the opportunity instantly. This was not just a battle to be won, but a trap to be sprung. He arranged his forces with the precision of a master craftsman, placing his phalanx, that forest of 18-foot sarissa spears, in the center to hold the line. On the right, he positioned himself with the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who formed the hammer to the phalanx's anvil. The left wing, traditionally the position of honor, went to Parmenion, his most trusted general, a grizzled veteran who had served Alexander's father and understood the delicate art of coordinated warfare. The battle itself unfolded like a deadly dance. Darius, perhaps seeking to end the campaign with a single decisive blow, ordered a massive assault on the Macedonian left, where Parmenion's forces bent but did not break under the pressure. Meanwhile, Alexander launched his own assault, not at the strongest point of the Persian line, but at its most crucial, the center where Darius himself commanded from his ornate chariot. The young Macedonian king charged through a gap in the enemy formation, his lance leveled directly at the heart of Persian power. For a moment, that lasted an eternity. The two kings faced each other across a few yards of blood-soaked earth. Darius, resplendent in royal purple and gold, the heir to Cyrus and Xerxes, master of 20 nations. Alexander, mud-spattered and fierce, leading from the front like a hero from the age of legends. The collision, when it came, was not just between two armies, but between two visions of the world. Darius blinked first. Seeing Alexander driving toward him like an avenging god, the Persian king turned his chariot and fled the field. The sight of their monarch in retreat broke the spirit of the Persian army like a dam bursting. What had been an organized battle line dissolved into chaos as units tried to follow their fleeing king or were trampled by their own retreating comrades. The victory at Issus was total, devastating, and personal. Alexander captured Darius's entire family, his wife, his daughters, his mother, treating them with respect even as he used them as pawns in the greater game. More importantly, he had broken the myth of Persian invincibility. Darius was no longer the king of kings, master of the world. He was just another opponent, and one who had shown his back to the enemy. But even as Alexander savored his triumph at Issus, he knew the real test still lay ahead. Darius had fled, yes, but the Persian Empire was far from broken. Like a wounded giant, it was gathering its strength for one final, apocalyptic confrontation. The great king retreated deep into his realm, beyond the Euphrates, beyond the Tigris, to the very heart of Mesopotamia where civilization itself had been born. There, on the endless plains where the first cities had risen from dust, he would make his stand. For 2 years, both kings prepared for what everyone understood would be the decisive battle. Darius stripped his empire bare, calling in troops from every corner of his domain. From the snow-capped mountains of the Hindu Kush came the Bactrian cavalry, horsemen so skilled they could loose arrows while hanging from their saddles at full gallop. The Scythians rode down from the steppes, their faces painted for war, their horses bred for endurance across the endless grasslands. Indian war elephants, those living fortresses of hide and tusk, made the long march westward, their handlers carrying the ancient secrets of controlling these beasts in battle. But perhaps most shocking of all were the new weapons Darius unveiled. Scythe chariots, their wheels fitted with curved blades designed to mow down infantry like wheat before the harvest. These were not the ceremonial vehicles of kings, but machines of war, built for one purpose: to break the Macedonian phalanx that had proven so devastatingly effective. Persian engineers had studied the defeats at Granicus and Issus, learning from failure with the cold precision of men who knew their empire's survival depended on innovation. The Persians even prepared the battlefield itself. On the plains near Gaugamela, they leveled the ground, removing every stone, every bump that might impede their cavalry or chariots. They turned the earth into a killing floor, smooth as a marble palace, perfect for the kind of sweeping charges that had once made Persian armies the terror of the ancient world. This would be no repeat of Issus, where terrain had favored the smaller force. Here, on ground of his own choosing, Darius would unleash the full fury of his empire. Alexander, meanwhile, faced problems that would have broken a lesser commander. His army was thousands of miles from home, their supply lines stretched beyond any reasonable limit. Many of his men had been campaigning for years, their armor patched and repatched, their weapons worn thin by countless battles. Desertion was a constant threat, and even among his most loyal officers, whispers began to circulate about the wisdom of pushing deeper into the Persian heartland. The young king's response was characteristically audacious. Rather than retreat to more defensible positions, he advanced toward the very heart of enemy territory. He knew that hesitation would be fatal, that his only chance lay in maintaining the momentum that had carried him this far. Like a gambler pushing all his chips to the center of the table, Alexander committed everything to one final roll of the dice. The intelligence reports that reached him as he approached Gaugamela must have been sobering. Persian numbers were beyond anything he had faced before, a host so vast it took hours just to march past a single point. Yet Alexander showed no sign of doubt, no trace of the fear that must have gnawed at him in the quiet hours before dawn. Instead, he threw himself into preparation with the intensity of a man who understood that perfection was the only path to survival. He drilled his troops relentlessly, not just in the basic movements they had practiced 1,000 times, but in new formations designed specifically for the battle to come. The traditional phalanx was adapted, made more flexible, able to respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. His cavalry trained in complex maneuvers that would allow them to strike like lightning, then withdraw before the enemy could respond. Every unit, from the elite companions to the humble slingers, rehearsed their role until it became second nature. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander worked on the minds of his men. He understood that battles are won as much by will as by weapons, that an army's spirit could be more valuable than its steel. In the evenings, he would walk among the campfires, sharing meals with common soldiers, listening to their fears, telling stories of past victories. He reminded them of the treasures they had won, the cities that had surrendered at their approach, the legends they were already becoming. On the night before the battle, as both armies lay encamped within sight of each other, Alexander made a decision that revealed the depth of his confidence. While Darius kept his forces in battle formation, expecting a night attack, the Macedonian king ordered his men to rest. He wanted them fresh for the coming struggle, their minds clear and their reflexes sharp. It was a calculated risk that spoke to his understanding of warfare's psychological dimension. As dawn broke over the plains of Gaugamela, the two armies began their final preparations. The Persian host spread across the horizon like a living tapestry, banners of 100 nations fluttering in the morning breeze. The sound of their war drums rolled across the plain like thunder, while the trumpeting of elephants and the neighing of thousands of horses created a symphony of anticipated violence. The Macedonians formed their lines with practiced efficiency, but even their veterans must have felt their hearts skip as they gazed upon the enemy host. This was not just an army, but a migration of nations, a force that seemed to stretch beyond the very edges of the world. Yet Alexander rode before them, his golden armor catching the first rays of sun, his voice carrying clearly across the ranks as he delivered words that would echo through history. The speech Alexander delivered that morning was not the flowery rhetoric of politicians or the empty promises of desperate commanders. It was the stark truth spoken by a man who had already led these soldiers through the fires of a dozen battles and emerged victorious each time. He reminded them of the gold that filled their wagons, the slaves who would make them rich, the cities that would bow before their names. But more than that, he reminded them of who they were: Macedonians, heirs to a warrior tradition that stretched back to the heroes of legend. Today, his voice rang out across the silent ranks. We face not just an army, but the accumulated power of centuries. Every nation that has ever knelt before Persian gold stands against us. Every warrior who has ever trembled at the mention of the great king's name has come to witness our destruction. The pause that followed was pregnant with tension, the only sound the whisper of wind across bronze and steel. Let them come. Let them see what Macedonians do to those who mistake numbers for courage. As the sun climbed higher, the two armies began their deadly ballet. Darius, magnificent in his golden chariot, took position at the center of his vast line, surrounded by the cream of Persian nobility. To his left stretched the Bactrian cavalry under Bessus, their horses dancing with nervous energy, their riders' faces hidden behind masks of beaten gold. On the right, Mazaeus commanded a host that included Armenian lancers and Cappadocian heavy cavalry, men whose ancestors had conquered nations while the Greeks still lived in mud huts. But it was the scythed chariots that drew the most attention, gleaming instruments of death positioned for maximum psychological impact. Their bronze blades caught the morning light like mirrors, each one a promise of carnage to come. The Persian engineers had calculated their effect down to the last detail. These machines would not just kill Macedonian soldiers, they would shatter their formations, create gaps that the following cavalry could exploit. It was innovation born of desperation, but innovation nonetheless. Alexander studied the enemy deployment with the cold eye of a master tactician. He saw the trap Darius had laid, the way the Persian formation was designed to envelop his smaller force like the jaws of some primordial beast. The scythed chariots would strike first, sowing chaos in his ranks. Then the cavalry would pour through the gaps, rolling up his flanks while the center pressed forward to complete the destruction. It was a sound plan, the kind that had crushed armies for generations. The young king's response was to do what no one expected. Instead of meeting the Persian formation head-on, he began a curious sideways movement, sliding his entire army toward the right, away from the carefully prepared killing ground. It looked like retreat, like the first sign of panic in the Macedonian ranks. Persian officers began to smile behind their beards, convinced that their enemy was already breaking. But Alexander was not retreating. He was thinking 3 moves ahead, like a chess master facing an amateur. By moving right, he was forcing Darius to extend his own line, stretching it thinner and thinner to maintain contact. The Persian king, terrified of being outflanked, ordered his left wing to match Alexander's movement. Slowly, inexorably, the mighty Persian army began to lose its perfect formation, gaps opening like wounds in its previously solid front. The scythed chariots launched their attack first, thundering across the plain in a display that should have struck terror into any army. The earth shook beneath their wheels, and the air filled with the screams of their drivers and the metallic shriek of their spinning blades. They bore down on the Macedonian phalanx like the very wrath of the gods, unstoppable instruments of destruction. Yet when they struck the Macedonian line, something extraordinary happened. Instead of shattering like glass, the phalanx opened like a flower, creating corridors through which the chariots passed harmlessly. Alexander's men had trained for this moment, practiced the precise timing needed to step aside at the last second, then close ranks behind the passing threat. Most of the chariots thundered through empty air, their deadly blades finding nothing but dust and shadows. Those few that did strike Macedonian soldiers were quickly overwhelmed, their crews dragged down by the very men they had been sent to destroy. The failure of the chariot charge was more than tactical, it was symbolic. The Persians had unveiled their secret weapon, their answer to Macedonian military innovation, and it had proven useless. Worse than useless, it had actually aided the enemy, as the riderless horses careered back through Persian ranks, spreading confusion and fear among troops who had expected to witness a massacre. Darius, watching from his golden chariot, must have felt the first cold touch of doubt. His carefully laid plans were unraveling, his overwhelming advantage in numbers meaning nothing as Alexander continued his maddening sideways dance. The Persian line grew thinner and thinner, stretched beyond its breaking point, gaps appearing where none should exist. It was like watching a master craftsman take apart a complex mechanism, each movement precise and purposeful. Alexander saw his moment and seized it with the instincts of a born killer. Gathering his companion cavalry around him like a spearhead of living steel, he launched himself not at the wings of the Persian army, but directly at its heart. The wedge formation he led was a thing of beauty and terror, a perfectly coordinated instrument of war that had been honed through years of constant campaigning. At its tip rode Alexander himself, his lance leveled, his golden armor making him a target that drew every eye on the battlefield. The collision was like the meeting of tectonic plates, a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The companions smashed through the Persian front line like a hammer through eggshells, their momentum carrying them deep into the enemy formation. Behind them came the hyperspists, elite infantry who followed their king into the very jaws of death, their short swords working with mechanical precision as they carved a path through the chaos. For a moment that lasted forever, Alexander found himself face to face with the flower of Persian nobility, men whose bloodlines stretched back to the conquest of Babylon, whose ancestors had ruled when Macedonia was nothing but a collection of mountain villages. They fought with the desperate courage of men who knew their world was ending, their curved swords flashing like silver flames in the desert Sunday. But courage alone was not enough against the concentrated fury of the Macedonian assault. The Persian center began to buckle, then crack, then shatter entirely. Units that had stood firm for centuries broke and ran, their ancient standards trampled in the dust by fleeing horses and panicked men. The sight of their comrades in full retreat spread panic through the ranks like wildfire, turning disciplined formations into a mob of terrified individuals thinking only of survival. Darius himself, the King of Kings, master of the world's greatest empire, made the same choice he had made at Issus. Faced with the sight of Alexander cutting through his bodyguard like wheat before the scythe, the Persian monarch turned his chariot and fled. The golden vehicle that had been the symbol of imperial power became a beacon of defeat, its retreat visible to every man on the battlefield. The sight of their king in flight broke the last vestiges of Persian resistance. What had been the greatest army ever assembled dissolved into chaos, a river of humanity flowing eastward in desperate flight. The Macedonians pursued with the ruthless efficiency of wolves, cutting down stragglers and capturing the vast baggage train that had followed the Persian host across half of Asia. But even as his enemies fled before him, Alexander's thoughts were already turning to the future. This was not just a military victory, but the death of an idea, the end of the Persian Empire that had dominated the ancient world for 2 centuries. In its place would rise something new, a fusion of East and West that would reshape civilization itself. The young Macedonian king had not just won a battle, he had conquered the future. The treasures captured at Gaugamela defied description. Gold and silver beyond counting, precious stones that had adorned the palaces of Babylon, silk and spices from the farthest reaches of the known world. But the real prize was far more valuable than material wealth. It was the acknowledgement, written in blood and dust across the plains of Mesopotamia, that Alexander was no longer just a conqueror, but the rightful heir to the greatest empire in history. The shockwaves of Gaugamela rippled across the ancient world like stones thrown into still water. In a single afternoon, Alexander had not merely defeated an army, He had shattered the natural order that had governed civilization for centuries. The Persian Empire, that colossus which had cast its shadow from India to Egypt, lay broken and leaderless, its king a fugitive in his own realm. But Alexander's true genius lay not just in winning battles, but in understanding what victory meant. He didn't simply conquer territories, he transformed them. Greek culture, philosophy, and military tactics spread like wildfire across 3 continents, creating a fusion that would define the ancient world for generations. Cities bearing his name rose from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan, each one a monument to the audacity of a young man who dared to dream beyond the horizon. The boy king who had crossed the Hellespont with dreams of glory had become something far greater, the architect of a new world order. His victories proved that with enough courage, intelligence, and sheer bloody-minded determination, even the impossible could be achieved. The ancient world would never be the same, and neither would the very concept of what one man could accomplish when he refused to accept the limits others tried to impose. The dust of countless marching feet rose like a golden cloud across the plains of Mesopotamia. It was the 1st of October 331 BCE, and the ancient world was about to witness something extraordinary. 2 of history's greatest military minds were converging on a flat expanse of land near the village of Gaugamela, each commanding forces that represented the pinnacle of their civilizations. On one side stood Darius III, the great king of the mighty Achaemenid Empire, ruler of territories stretching from India to Egypt, at the head of what may have been the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world. On the other side, a young Macedonian king barely 25 years old, leading a force outnumbered by margins that would terrify any reasonable commander. Yet Alexander of Macedon was far from reasonable. He was a man possessed by dreams of conquest that defied all logic, and on this day, those dreams would either die in the dust of Gaugamela or reshape the known world forever. The morning air was thick with tension as the 2 armies faced each other across the plain. This was no ordinary battle. This was the collision of civilizations, the moment when East would meet West in a symphony of bronze and steel that would echo through the ages. The stakes could not have been higher. For Darius, defeat meant the end of an empire that had ruled the known world for over 2 centuries. For Alexander, victory would mean the fulfillment of a destiny he believed had been written by the gods themselves. But how had these 2 men, these 2 armies, these 2 worlds, come to this moment of ultimate confrontation? The story begins not on the plains of Gaugamela, but in the marble halls of Pella, where a young prince named Alexander was learning the art of war from the greatest minds of his age. The Achaemenid Empire in 331 BCE was a colossus that bestrode the ancient world like no power before or since. Founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, it had grown through conquest and diplomacy to encompass nearly 3 million square miles of territory. From the sun-baked deserts of Egypt to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush, from the bustling ports of Ionia to the fertile valleys of Bactria, the Persian Empire was a tapestry of peoples, languages, and cultures united under the rule of the King of Kings. Darius III had inherited this vast realm, but he had also inherited its problems. The empire was simply too large to govern effectively. Rebellions simmered in distant provinces. Satraps, the provincial governors, often acted more like independent kings than loyal subjects. The treasury, once overflowing with tribute from conquered lands, was strained by the costs of maintaining such a massive domain. And now, from the west, came a new threat, unlike any the Persians had faced before. Alexander had already proven himself no ordinary enemy. In 334 BCE, he had crossed the Hellespont with an army of just over 30,000 men, a force that seemed laughably small compared to the resources at Darius's disposal. Yet in battle after battle, this young Macedonian had achieved the impossible. At the Granicus River, he had shattered a Persian army and opened the gates to Asia Minor. At Issus, in one of history's most dramatic reversals, he had defeated Darius himself, forcing the great king to flee the battlefield and abandon his family to Alexander's mercy. The psychological impact of Issus had been devastating for Persian morale. Their invincible king had been humiliated by a barbarian youth from the edges of the civilized world. Cities that had been Persian for generations opened their gates to Alexander without a fight. Tyre, the great island fortress, fell after a siege that demonstrated Alexander's tactical genius. Egypt, the jewel of the Persian crown, welcomed him as a liberator. With each victory, Alexander's legend grew, and with it, the belief that he was truly favored by the gods. But Darius was far from finished. The great king understood that his empire's survival depended on stopping Alexander before the Macedonian could penetrate deeper into the Persian heartland. After Issus, Darius had retreated to Babylon, where he began assembling an army that would dwarf anything he had fielded before. This would not be another hasty response to Alexander's advance. This would be a carefully planned campaign designed to use Persia's greatest advantage, its seemingly inexhaustible manpower. From every corner of the empire, warriors answered the call. The Immortals, the elite guard of the Persian king, marched from Persepolis with their gleaming scale armor and golden spears. From the steppes of Central Asia came Scythian horse archers, masters of mounted warfare whose arrows could darken the sky. Indian war elephants, massive beasts that struck terror into any army that had never faced them, trumpeted their way across the dusty roads to Babylon. Bactrian cavalry, renowned for their skill and courage, rode from the mountains of Afghanistan. Median infantry, descendants of the people who had helped Cyrus build the empire, formed up in their traditional phalanxes. The numbers were staggering. Ancient sources claim Darius assembled over 1 million men, though modern historians believe the true figure was closer to 200,000, still a massive force by ancient standards. What mattered was not the exact number, but the psychological impact of such a host. This was an army drawn from every nation under Persian rule, a demonstration of the empire's power and reach. Surely no force on earth could stand against such overwhelming numbers. Darius chose his battleground carefully. Unlike at Issus, where the narrow coastal plain had prevented him from using his numerical advantage, the great king selected the plains near Gaugamela specifically because they offered the room his massive army needed to deploy. The ground was flat and open, perfect for his cavalry and chariots. He even had the battlefield prepared, leveling rough patches and clearing obstacles that might hinder his forces. This time, there would be no surprises, no tactical tricks that could offset his overwhelming superiority in numbers. Meanwhile, Alexander faced the greatest challenge of his career. His army, though seasoned by years of campaigning, was still vastly outnumbered. Many of his men were growing weary of constant warfare, homesick for Macedonia and the families they had left behind. Some questioned whether their young king's ambitions had finally exceeded his abilities. The Persian Empire was vast, wealthy, and seemingly inexhaustible. Even if they won at Gaugamela, what then? How could 30,000 Macedonians hope to hold down an empire of millions? But Alexander had something that could not be measured in numbers. He had an army that believed in him absolutely. Veterans who had seen him lead from the front in battle after battle, sharing their dangers and their triumphs. He had generals who had grown up with him, men like Hephaestion and Ptolemy who understood his mind and could execute his most complex battle plans. And he had a tactical system, the Macedonian phalanx combined with heavy cavalry, that had proven its superiority time and again. As the two armies converged on Gaugamela, the ancient world held its breath. This was more than a battle between two kings. This was a clash between two ways of life, two visions of how the world should be ordered. The Persian system was based on the rule of one man over many peoples, each maintaining their own customs and traditions under the umbrella of imperial authority. The Greek system, as interpreted by Alexander, was based on the spread of Hellenic culture and values, the creation of a unified world bound together by shared beliefs and practices. The night before the battle, both armies made their final preparations. In the Persian camp, priests performed ancient rituals, calling upon Ahura Mazda to grant victory to the forces of light over darkness. In the Macedonian camp, Alexander consulted the omens and found them favorable. Tomorrow would bring either the fulfillment of his destiny or the end of his dreams of world conquest. As dawn broke over the plains of Gaugamela, the very air seemed to tremble with anticipation. The sun climbed slowly above the horizon, casting long shadows across a landscape that would soon be transformed into one of history's greatest battlefields. Both armies stirred to life with the methodical precision of well-oiled war machines, each man knowing that this day would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the known world. In the Persian camp, the scene was one of organized chaos on an almost incomprehensible scale. Darius had arranged his forces with the meticulous care of a master strategist. At the center of his line stood the Immortals, their bronze-scaled armor gleaming like the skin of some mythical dragon. These were the elite of the elite, 10,000 men whose ranks were always kept at full strength, hence their name. Each carried a golden spear, and headed wore the distinctive felt cap that marked them as the personal guard of the great king. To their left and right stretched formations that represented the diversity of the Persian Empire. Medes in their traditional garb stood shoulder to shoulder with Assyrians, whose ancestors had once ruled Mesopotamia. Sassay warriors from the far steppes fingered their composite bows, while Bactrian cavalry checked their weapons one final time. The variety of armor, weapons, and fighting styles was staggering, yet Darius had welded this polyglot force into a coherent military instrument through years of training and the promise of rich rewards for victory. But the true terror of Darius's army lay not in its infantry. Impressive as they were, the great king had deployed over 200 scythed chariots along his front line, fearsome war machines designed to break enemy formations through sheer shock and carnage. Each chariot was fitted with razor-sharp blades extending from the wheels and axles, turning them into rolling engines of destruction. Behind them waited 15 war elephants, massive beasts whose very presence on a battlefield could cause panic among troops who had never faced such creatures. The Persian cavalry, numbering in the tens of thousands, formed the wings of Darius's formation. These were not the light horse archers of the steppes, but heavy cavalry armed with long lances and protected by mail armor. Many were Persians of noble birth, men who had trained for war from childhood and whose families had served the crown for generations. They sat their horses with quiet confidence, knowing that their charge had broken enemy lines from India to Egypt. Alexander's army, by contrast, seemed almost intimate in its scale. Yet what it lacked in numbers, it more than compensated for in cohesion and experience. The Macedonian phalanx formed the center of his line, a forest of 18-foot sarissas that created an impenetrable hedge of bronze-tipped death. These were the men who had followed Alexander across 2 continents, veterans whose discipline and skill had been forged in the crucible of countless battles. The young king had made several crucial modifications to his traditional formation for this encounter. Knowing he would be vastly outnumbered, Alexander had refused his left wing, pulling it back at an angle to prevent encirclement while concentrating his strength on his right. There, he positioned his companion cavalry, the elite heavy horsemen who had charged with him through every major battle of the campaign. These were more than soldiers. They were his friends, his brothers in arms, men who would follow him into the very gates of Hades if he commanded it. Alexander himself would ride with the companions, as was his custom. This was not mere bravado, though his enemies often dismissed it as such. The king understood that in ancient warfare, leadership was intensely personal. His men needed to see him, to know he shared their dangers. More than that, Alexander possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense the crucial moment in battle, the instant when a decisive blow could shatter an entire army. As the morning progressed, both commanders made their final dispositions. Darius positioned himself in the center of his line, surrounded by the Immortals and mounted on a towering chariot that made him visible to every man in his army. This was calculated theater as much as military necessity. The great king needed to project strength and confidence to forces drawn from dozens of different peoples and cultures. His presence was the symbol that held this vast coalition together. Alexander, meanwhile, moved constantly along his line, speaking with his officers, encouraging his men, making last-minute adjustments to his formation. He had divided his army into multiple commands, giving each general specific objectives and the authority to adapt to changing circumstances. This was the Macedonian way of war, flexible and responsive, quite different from the more rigid Persian approach. The psychological warfare had already begun. Persian heralds rode forward under banners of truce, offering terms that would have made Alexander ruler of half the known world. He could have Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and vast treasures beyond counting. All he needed to do was acknowledge Persian suzerainty and retreat beyond the Euphrates. It was a generous offer, one that many of Alexander's own officers thought he should consider. But Alexander had not come this far to settle for half measures. His vision encompassed nothing less than the conquest of the entire Persian Empire, the fulfillment of his belief that he was destined to rule the world. The heralds returned to Darius with a simple message. There could be only one king of Asia, and Alexander intended to claim that title on the field of battle. The tension reached its peak as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Both armies were now fully deployed, separated by perhaps half a mile of open ground. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of horses stamping and men checking their equipment one final time. This was the moment every warrior dreaded and craved in equal measure, when all the preparation, all the training, all the courage would be put to the ultimate test. Darius made the first move, signaling his chariots to advance. The ground trembled as 200 war machines rolled forward, their scythe blades glinting in the sun like the wings of some terrible mechanical bird of prey. Behind them, the great king's host began its advance. A tide of humanity stretching from horizon to horizon, banners snapping in the wind, the sound of their war cries echoing across the plain like distant thunder. Alexander watched them come with the calm of a man who had already seen this moment in his dreams. He had spent the night before the battle studying the ground, calculating angles and distances, visualizing exactly how the engagement would unfold. Now, as Darius's army approached, everything was proceeding exactly as he had foreseen. The young Macedonian king raised his hand, and across his compact line, trumpets sang their bronze-throated song. This was the moment Alexander had been preparing for his entire life. Every lesson from Aristotle, every hour spent drilling with his companions, every battle fought across Asia Minor had led to this single point in time. The fate of two empires now hung in the balance, suspended like a sword over the heads of 100,000 warriors. As the Persian chariots thundered across the plain, their terrible blades spinning death with every revolution, Alexander's response was swift and decisive. Rather than meet them head-on, he ordered his light infantry forward. Agrianian javelin throwers and Cretan archers, men who had learned their craft hunting in mountain valleys and island shores, spread out in loose formations. These were not the rigid phalanxes of citizen soldiers, but professionals who understood that survival depended on mobility and marksmanship. The first volley of javelins and arrows rose like a deadly cloud, arcing high before plunging down among the charging chariots. Horses screamed and stumbled, their drivers fighting desperately to maintain control as bronze points found their marks. Many chariots veered off course, their deadly momentum dissipated by the storm of missiles. Others simply collapsed as their teams were brought down, becoming obstacles rather than weapons. But this was merely the opening movement in Alexander's symphony of destruction. As the surviving chariots reached his main line, another element of his tactical genius revealed itself. The Macedonian phalanx, that seemingly solid wall of spears, suddenly opened like a flower blooming in reverse. Predetermined gaps appeared between the companies, channels through which the remaining chariots could pass harmlessly to the rear, where reserve troops waited to dispatch the isolated crews. Darius watched from his command position as his most fearsome weapons were neutralized with almost casual efficiency. The chariots that had broken Persian enemies for generations were being treated like a minor inconvenience by these Western barbarians. Yet the great king showed no sign of panic. This was only the beginning, and he still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. The main Persian advance now began in earnest. The immortals stepped forward with measured precision, their golden spears catching the sunlight like a field of deadly wheat. Behind them came wave after wave of infantry, Median spearmen and Assyrian archers, Bactrian swordsmen and Sogdian javelin throwers. The sound of their approach was like the roar of an approaching storm, a rumble that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. Alexander's response was to do something that violated every principle of conventional warfare. Instead of remaining in his strong defensive position, he ordered his entire army to advance obliquely, moving forward and to his right at an angle that would take him off the carefully prepared battlefield Darius had chosen. It was a maneuver of breathtaking audacity, one that exposed his smaller force to potential disaster if it failed. The Persian king immediately recognized the danger. If Alexander succeeded in drawing the battle onto rougher ground, it would negate much of the Persian advantage in cavalry and chariots. Darius ordered his left wing to wheel inward, attempting to catch the Macedonians in their movement and pin them against his center. What followed was a collision of such violence that the sound could be heard for miles. The Macedonian phalanx, still advancing at their oblique angle, crashed into the Persian left with the force of an avalanche. The 18-foot sarissas, held by men who had drilled together for years, punched through Persian shields and armor with deadly precision. The front ranks of the Persian formation simply disappeared, trampled underfoot or impaled on the forest of spear points. Yet the Persians were far from broken. Their numerical advantage began to tell as fresh formations moved up to replace the fallen. The Immortals, showing why they had earned their fearsome reputation, held firm against the Macedonian assault. Their shorter spears and lighter armor made them more flexible in the melee, and their discipline was absolute. Step by step, they began to push back against Alexander's center. On the Persian right wing, Mazaeus, one of Darius's most capable generals, launched a massive cavalry assault against the Macedonian left. Thousands of Persian and allied horsemen swept forward like a breaking dam, their lances lowered, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. The Thessalian cavalry under Parmenion found themselves fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. For a moment, it seemed as though Darius's plan might succeed. The Persian center was holding. Their right wing was achieving local superiority, and their sheer numbers were beginning to tell. In the confusion and dust of battle, it became difficult for either side to maintain clear command and control. Individual units found themselves isolated, fighting desperately against superior numbers while hoping that their comrades elsewhere were faring better. But Alexander had been waiting for precisely this moment. As the Persian line became stretched and distorted by the fighting, gaps began to appear in their formation. The young king, mounted on his warhorse Bucephalus and surrounded by his companion cavalry, spotted the opening he had been seeking. It was there, just to the left of where Darius himself stood with the Immortals, a weakness in the line caused by units being drawn off to support the flanks. Without hesitation, Alexander spurred Bucephalus forward, his lance leveled, his bronze armor blazing in the sun. Behind him came the flower of Macedonian nobility, men who had grown up with him in the palace at Pella, who had shared his dreams of conquest from the very beginning. They formed a wedge of steel and determination that punched through the Persian line like a spear thrust through silk. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Persian soldiers who had been fighting steadily suddenly found the enemy king himself bearing down on their position. Panic began to spread through the ranks as word passed that Alexander was cutting his way toward the great king himself. Units that had been holding firm moments before began to waver and break. Darius found himself in mortal danger for the second time in his confrontations with Alexander. The Macedonian wedge was driving straight toward his position, cutting down Immortals and royal guards with ruthless efficiency. The great king's chariot, so imposing at the start of the battle, now became a liability, making him a visible target while limiting his mobility. The moment of decision had arrived. Darius could stand and fight, risking capture or death but maintaining the honor of his position, or he could retreat and live to fight another day. The choice would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Around the Persian king, his bodyguards fought with desperate courage, knowing that their lives and honor depended on protecting their sovereign. Yet they could see the tide of battle turning, could feel the momentum shifting irreversibly toward the Macedonians. The carefully planned battle was dissolving into chaos, and in chaos, Alexander thrived while conventional armies crumbled. The dust and din of combat had reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. This was no longer merely a battle between armies, but a cosmic struggle between order and ambition, between the established world and the vision of a young king who believed himself destined to reshape it entirely. As the dust swirled around the two kings, Separated by mere yards but representing worlds apart, the decisive moment had arrived. Darius, seeing Alexander's wedge of cavalry carving through his elite guards like a blade through parchment, made the choice that would echo through history. The great king wheeled his chariot around and fled the battlefield, his purple cloak streaming behind him as he abandoned his army to save his own life. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Word of the king's flight spread through the Persian ranks faster than wildfire through dry grass. Units that had been holding firm against the Macedonian assault suddenly found their will to fight evaporating. What was the point of dying for a king who would not die for them? The carefully orchestrated formations began to dissolve as individual soldiers made their own calculations about survival versus honor. Alexander, still fighting at the tip of his wedge, sensed the change before he saw it. The resistance that had been so fierce moments before was crumbling. Persian nobles who had fought like lions were now looking over their shoulders for escape routes. The immortals, those legendary warriors whose name had struck fear into enemies for generations, were breaking ranks and streaming toward the rear. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Alexander faced a crucial decision. His instinct was to pursue Darius personally, to end this war once and for all by capturing the Persian king. But reports reached him that his left wing under Parmenion was in serious trouble. The old general was fighting for his life against Mazaeus and thousands of Persian cavalry. If that flank collapsed, the entire Macedonian army could be rolled up from behind. The choice Alexander made in that moment revealed the true measure of his greatness. Instead of pursuing personal glory and the capture of Darius, he turned his cavalry to rescue Parmenion and secure complete victory. By day's end, the Achaemenid Empire lay shattered on the plains of Gaugamela. Its two-century reign ended by the tactical brilliance and unshakable will of a 25-year-old king who had dared to dream of conquering the world. In the scorching heat of an August morning in 216 BCE, the fate of the ancient world hung in the balance on a dusty plain in southeastern Italy. Here, near the forgotten village of Cannae, two colossal armies prepared to clash in what would become the most devastating single day of combat in Roman history. On one side stood the might of the Roman Republic, fielding the largest army they had ever assembled, over 80,000 men strong, their bronze armor glinting in the Mediterranean sun. On the other side waited Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general whose name had already become synonymous with terror across the Italian peninsula. What unfolded that day would not merely be a battle. It would be a masterclass in military genius that left Rome's legions shattered and bleeding, with casualties so staggering that historians still struggle to comprehend the scale of destruction. This is the story of Cannae, where tactical brilliance met Roman stubbornness, and where one man's strategic vision transformed a numerical disadvantage into the most perfect military annihilation ever recorded. The road to Cannae began not with the clash of swords, but with the grinding wheels of political ambition and strategic miscalculation. By the summer of 216 BCE, Hannibal had already been terrorizing Italy for 2 full years, his diverse army of Carthaginians, Spaniards, Gauls, and Numidians cutting a bloody swath through the heart of Roman territory. The memories of Trebia and Lake Trasimene still haunted Roman nightmares. At Trebia, in the freezing winter of 218, Hannibal had lured an entire Roman army into an ambush, slaughtering them in the icy waters of the river. At Lake Trasimene, he had orchestrated perhaps the largest ambush in military history, trapping and annihilating another consular army in the morning mist. In just 2 battles, this Carthaginian upstart had killed as many as 50,000 Roman soldiers, veterans, and fresh recruits alike, falling before his tactical genius. The Romans, however, were not a people easily cowed. Under the steady hand of Quintus Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator in Rome's hour of crisis, they had adopted a strategy of patience and harassment. Fabius refused to give Hannibal the pitched battle he craved, instead shadowing the Carthaginian army, cutting supply lines, and avoiding direct confrontation. This strategy of attrition earned Fabius the nickname Cunctator, the delayer, and while it saved Roman lives, it did nothing to satisfy Roman pride. For a people raised on tales of conquest and glory, watching their countryside burn while their armies retreated was intolerable. The Roman spirit demanded action, demanded vengeance, demanded blood, As the seasons turned and Hannibal continued his rampage through southern Italy, Roman patience finally snapped. The elections of 216 BCE brought forth two new consuls who embodied the competing philosophies tearing at the heart of Roman strategy. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a patrician from an established military family, understood the wisdom of caution when facing Hannibal. He had studied the Carthaginians' methods, recognized the trap that lay in underestimating this foreign genius. But his co-consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, represented the voice of popular fury. A plebeian who had risen through political cunning rather than military brilliance, Varro promised the Roman people what they desperately wanted to hear. He would take the fight to Hannibal. He would crush this barbarian invader through sheer Roman might. He would restore Roman honor with Roman steel. The Senate, swayed by popular pressure and their own frustration with the Fabian strategy, made a decision that would haunt them for generations. They authorized the raising of 8 full legions, double the normal consular army, along with an equal number of allied troops. Never before had Rome fielded such a massive force. The army that marched north toward Hannibal numbered over 80,000 men, the largest military force the Republic had ever assembled. It was a statement written in bronze and iron, a declaration that Rome's patience was exhausted and her wrath was terrible to behold. But size alone does not win battles, and the Roman army that trudged through the Italian summer toward its appointment with destiny carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Many of the legionaries were hastily recruited and poorly trained. The devastating losses at Trebia and Trasimene had forced Rome to lower its recruitment standards, drafting men who lacked the martial training that had made the legions legendary. Property requirements were abandoned in the desperate scramble for manpower, meaning many soldiers had never held a sword before donning their first mail shirt. These were not the seasoned veterans who had conquered Gaul and subdued the Mediterranean. These were farmers and shopkeepers, fathers and sons, thrust into the crucible of war with barely enough training to hold formation. Even more dangerous than inexperience was the divided command that plagued the Roman expedition. Following ancient tradition, the two consuls alternated daily command of the combined army, a system that worked adequately in smaller campaigns but proved catastrophic when facing an opponent of Hannibal's caliber. Paulus advocated caution, seeking to engage Hannibal only on favorable terms. Varro burned with impatience, eager to bring the Carthaginian to battle and claim the glory of victory. This fundamental disagreement created a paralysis of purpose that Hannibal would exploit with deadly precision. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian general was orchestrating a masterpiece of strategic manipulation. In the spring of 216, as the Romans debated and delayed, Hannibal struck at the heart of their logistics network. He seized the fortress of Cannae, a crucial supply depot that controlled the grain stores for much of southeastern Italy. The capture was not merely tactical but psychological. By taking Cannae, Hannibal demonstrated that he could strike anywhere, control any territory, and threaten Rome's ability to feed its people and allies. The message was clear. Rome could either come to him on ground of his choosing, or watch helplessly as their empire crumbled piece by piece. The location Hannibal chose for his trap was perfect in its simplicity. The plains around Cannae offered ample room for maneuver, crucial for an army whose strength lay in mobility and tactical flexibility. The Aufidus River provided a natural anchor for defensive positions, while limiting Roman options for deployment. Most cunningly, Hannibal positioned his forces so that when the Romans advanced, they would face south into the blazing August sun, with the hot Libeccio wind blowing dust and sand directly into their eyes. Every environmental factor was calculated to give the Carthaginians an advantage. Every detail planned with the precision of an artist creating his masterwork. As the Roman army approached Cannae in late July, they found themselves facing an enemy who seemed almost eager for battle. Hannibal's diverse coalition of warriors had been campaigning in Italy for 2 years now, far from their homelands, sustained only by victory and the promise of plunder. His army numbered perhaps 40 to 50,000 men, barely half the size of the Roman force. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in experience and unity of purpose. These were veterans of 100 skirmishes, hardened by years of constant warfare, bound together by their absolute faith in their commander's genius. The Carthaginian ranks bristled with the spoils of previous victories. Many wore Roman mail taken from the dead at Trasimene, carried Roman shields stripped from the battlefield at Trebia. Their weapons were a mixture of Carthaginian craftsmanship and captured Roman steel, but their confidence was purely their own. They had followed Hannibal across the Alps, through the snows of the Pyrenees, and across the breadth of Italy. They had seen him turn impossible situations into glorious victories, transform numerical disadvantage into tactical supremacy. When he told them that one more victory would bring them riches beyond imagination and a path home paved with Roman gold, they believed him without question. The stage was set for the greatest tactical demonstration in military history. Rome had brought overwhelming numbers, confident that sheer mass would crush their tormentor. Hannibal had prepared a lesson in the art of war that would echo through the ages, a demonstration that genius and experience could triumph over brute force and blind courage. As the two armies faced each other across the dusty plain of Cannae, neither side could know that they were about to participate in a battle that would redefine the very nature of warfare itself. The morning of the 2nd of August, 216 BCE, dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down upon the armies like the weight of destiny itself. Across the plain of Cannae, 80,000 Roman soldiers stirred in their camps, the clatter of bronze and iron echoing through the ranks as they prepared for what many believed would be the decisive battle of the war. Standard-bearers unfurled the golden eagles of the legions, their proud symbols catching the early light, while centurions barked orders that had been heard on 100 battlefields across the Mediterranean. Yet beneath the familiar rituals of Roman military preparation lay an undercurrent of tension that even the most seasoned veterans could feel in their bones. The command structure that should have been Rome's strength had become its greatest weakness. On this fateful day, it was Consul Varro's turn to lead, and his aggressive nature burned like a fever through the ranks. He strode among the legions, his voice carrying promises of glory and vengeance, reminding his soldiers that they outnumbered the enemy nearly 2 to 1. The Carthaginians, he declared, were nothing more than a rabble of mercenaries, far from home, weakened by 2 years of campaigning. Today, Roman steel would end Hannibal's reign of terror once and for all. His co-consul Paulus watched this display with growing unease, recognizing the dangerous overconfidence that Hannibal had exploited so masterfully at Trebia and Trasimene. But the die was cast, and Roman tradition demanded that he support his colleague's decision, even as every instinct screamed warnings that went unheeded. The Roman deployment reflected Varro's philosophy of overwhelming force applied with brutal simplicity. The 8 legions were arranged in the traditional formation, but packed far more densely than usual. Where Roman doctrine called for flexible maniples that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions, Varro created a massive battering ram of human flesh and bronze. The hastily trained recruits were packed shoulder to shoulder with veterans, their inexperience masked by the sheer weight of numbers. On the flanks, Roman and allied cavalry took their positions, outnumbered by their Carthaginian counterparts, but confident in their ability to hold the line long enough for the infantry to break through Hannibal's center. The plan was Roman warfare at its most elemental: advance, engage, and crush the enemy through superior numbers and Roman discipline. Across the field, Hannibal surveyed the Roman preparations with the eye of a master craftsman examining raw materials. What the Romans saw as overwhelming strength, he recognized as fatal rigidity. Their dense formation would indeed pack tremendous punch in the initial assault, but it would also rob them of the flexibility that had made the legions legendary. Packed so tightly, the Romans would struggle to maneuver once battle was joined, unable to adapt to changing circumstances or exploit tactical opportunities. More crucially, their very numbers would become a liability once Hannibal's trap was sprung, as the press of bodies would prevent orderly withdrawal or tactical repositioning. The Carthaginian deployment was a work of art disguised as military necessity. At first glance, it appeared almost conventional. Infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, reserves positioned to reinforce where needed. But every element was precisely calculated to serve Hannibal's greater design. In the center, he placed his Gallic and Spanish warriors, fierce fighters but equipped with lighter armor and shorter weapons than their Roman counterparts. To the casual observer, this seemed like a natural choice, putting his most expendable troops where they would bear the brunt of the Roman assault. But Hannibal's genius lay in understanding that these warriors, while individually brave, could be trusted to execute a controlled fighting withdrawal that would draw the Romans ever deeper into his web. On the wings of his infantry line, carefully concealed behind the more lightly equipped center troops, Hannibal positioned his African veterans. These were the elite of his army, warriors who had fought beside him since the siege of Saguntum, equipped with the finest armor and weapons that Carthaginian gold could buy. Many wore captured Roman mail, their shields and helmets bearing the marks of previous victories. They would remain motionless as the battle developed, invisible to Roman eyes, waiting for the moment when Hannibal would unleash them like hunting wolves upon the flanks of the advancing legions. Their discipline was absolute, their trust in their commander complete. When the signal came, they would move with the precision of a machine designed for killing. But perhaps the most crucial element of Hannibal's formation was his cavalry. On his left flank, Hasdrubal commanded the heavy Carthaginian and Spanish horse, warriors mounted on powerful war horses and armed with long spears perfect for shock combat. These men had learned their trade in the brutal cavalry warfare of Iberia, where mounted combat was an art form practiced with deadly precision. On the right flank, the Numidian light cavalry waited with barely contained energy, their small, agile horses dancing beneath riders who had been born in the saddle. These were not men who fought for gold or glory, but for the pure joy of battle, their javelins and short swords extensions of their will. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became almost unbearable, both armies completed their preparations. The Romans performed their traditional sacrifices, examining the entrails of sacred animals for omens of victory. The augurs proclaimed favorable signs, though whether from genuine belief or political necessity, none could say. Prayers were offered to Mars, god of war, and to Jupiter, protector of Rome, while the soldiers checked their equipment one final time. Sword belts were tightened, shield grips adjusted, and armor straps secured. For many, it would be the last such ritual they would ever perform. In the Carthaginian ranks, a different kind of preparation took place. Hannibal moved among his men not as a distant commander but as a fellow warrior, speaking to his soldiers in their own languages, reminding them of shared victories and common purpose. To the Gauls, he spoke of Roman oppression and the freedom that victory would bring. To the Spaniards, he recalled the silver mines and fertile valleys they had left behind, promising that Roman wealth would compensate for their sacrifice. To the Africans, he spoke as a son of Carthage, invoking the shades of ancient heroes and the glory that awaited those who died in service to their homeland. His words were not speeches but conversations, personal connections that bound his diverse army together with bonds stronger than any chain of command. The psychological preparation was perhaps more important than the physical deployment. Hannibal understood that his numerical disadvantage meant that every one of his soldiers would need to fight with the strength of 2 Romans, but he also knew that his men possessed something the hastily assembled Roman army lacked: absolute confidence in victory. They had followed him across the Alps when experts said it was impossible. They had defeated Roman armies at Trebia and Trasimene when outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They had seen their commander turn desperate situations into glorious triumphs through sheer tactical genius. When he promised them that this day would crown all their previous victories, they believed him without question. The final element of Hannibal's preparation was perhaps the most subtle and most devastating. As the Roman army advanced across the plain, they found themselves marching directly into the teeth of the Libeccio, the hot southern wind that swept across the battlefield carrying clouds of choking dust. What seemed like mere meteorological misfortune was actually the result of Hannibal's careful positioning. He had deliberately chosen ground that would force the Romans to advance with the wind in their faces, sand and grit stinging their eyes and coating their throats. Combined with the brutal August heat and the weight of their bronze armor, this environmental factor would sap Roman strength even before the first javelin was thrown. As the distance between the armies narrowed and the moment of contact approached, both sides could feel the electric tension that precedes great battles. The Romans advanced in their traditional formation, the steady tramp of hobnailed sandals beating out the rhythm of empire, their shields locked and spears leveled. Behind them stretched the greatest army Rome had ever fielded, a river of bronze and iron that seemed capable of sweeping away any opposition. Yet ahead of them waited not merely an enemy army, but a trap so perfectly conceived that it would transform Roman strength into Roman doom, numerical superiority into catastrophic vulnerability. As the morning sun reached its merciless peak, the 2 armies finally closed to within shouting distance, and the air itself seemed to crackle with the tension of impending violence. The Romans could see their enemies now, not as distant figures on the horizon, but as individual warriors whose faces bore the scars of countless battles. The Carthaginian line stretched before them in a formation that appeared almost conventional, yet something about it felt wrong to the experienced Roman officers. The enemy center bulged forward in a slight crescent, as if Hannibal were offering his weakest troops as bait. To Roman eyes, accustomed to the rigid perfection of legion formations, this irregular deployment looked like amateur hour, the mistake of a barbarian commander who lacked proper military training. Varro seized upon this apparent weakness with the enthusiasm of a man who had finally found vindication for his aggressive strategy. Here was proof that Hannibal, for all his reputation, was no match for Roman discipline and superior numbers. The Carthaginian center looked thin, almost fragile, manned by what appeared to be Gallic and Spanish troops in their characteristic chainmail and colorful shields. These were the same warriors who had broken at Caesar's approach in Gaul, the same tribal fighters who valued individual glory over tactical cohesion. Surely 8 Roman legions, packed dense as a forest of spears, could smash through such a formation like a hammer through parchment. But what Varro could not see, what his eagerness blinded him to, was the deadly precision behind Hannibal's seemingly casual deployment. The Carthaginian general had spent years studying Roman tactics, understanding not just their strengths but their fatal weaknesses. He knew that Roman commanders, trained from childhood to value aggression and direct assault, would see his forward curved center as an invitation to attack. He understood that the Roman military mind, shaped by generations of successful conquest, could not resist the opportunity to apply overwhelming force at what appeared to be the enemy's weakest point. As the armies drew closer, individual challenges began to ring out across the narrowing gap. Roman centurions, their transverse crests marking them as leaders, shouted insults in broken Gallic and Spanish, daring their counterparts to single combat. From the Carthaginian ranks came answering taunts in a dozen languages, the polyglot army of Hannibal united in their contempt for Roman arrogance. Numidian horsemen wheeled their mounts in elaborate displays of horsemanship, their javelins glinting like deadly flowers in the harsh sunlight. The sound was deafening. The clatter of armor, the neighing of horses, the rhythmic chanting of war songs, and underneath it all, the steady drum of thousands of feet marching across the dusty plain. The Roman advance began with all the majesty and terror that had conquered half the world. The legions moved forward in perfect unison, their shields locked in the testudo formation, bronze overlapping bronze until they resembled some great armored beast crawling across the battlefield. Above the shield wall, the points of their pila caught the sun like stars, while the golden eagles of the legions flew proudly in the morning breeze. It was a sight that had broken the will of countless enemies, from the painted warriors of Britain to the elephant armies of the East. The very earth seemed to tremble beneath the weight of Roman power, as if the gods themselves acknowledged the might of the approaching storm. Hannibal watched this display with the calculating eye of a master chess player, observing his opponent's opening move. Every step the Romans took was exactly as he had predicted, every tactical decision falling perfectly into the web he had spent months weaving. As the legions advanced, their dense formation forced them into an ever-narrowing front, compressed by the very numbers that Varro believed were his greatest asset. The Roman army, so magnificent in its disciplined advance, was unconsciously transforming itself into the perfect victim for the trap that awaited. The first contact came not with the crash of shield on shield, but with the whistle of javelins cutting through the superheated air. The Roman front ranks hurled their pila in the traditional opening of battle, the heavy spears arcing over the narrowing gap to crash into the Carthaginian line. The sound was like hail on a bronze roof, metal striking metal in a percussion that could be heard for miles. Some javelins found their mark, punching through mail and flesh, but many more clattered harmlessly against raised shields or buried themselves in the dusty ground. The Carthaginian response was immediate and devastating. From the center of their line, Gallic warriors hurled their own spears, while Spanish infantry launched a storm of falcata cuts that gleamed like silver lightning in the harsh sun. But it was from the flanks that the real answer came, as Numidian cavalry swept forward in a cloud of dust, their javelins seeking gaps in Roman armor with the precision of hunting hawks. The light horsemen danced just beyond the reach of Roman weapons, loosing their missiles and wheeling away before the legionaries could respond. As the missile exchange reached its crescendo, Varro gave the order that sealed his army's fate. The Roman trumpets sounded the advance, their brazen notes cutting through the din of battle like the voice of Mars himself. The legions surged forward with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. 8 full legions of Roman infantry, charging across the remaining distance with their gladii drawn and murder in their hearts. It was the moment Hannibal had been waiting for, the instant when Roman aggression would transform from strength into fatal weakness. The collision, when it came, was like the meeting of 2 mountain ranges, a crash that sent shockwaves rippling across the battlefield. The Roman front rank slammed into the Carthaginian center with irresistible force, their shields smashing against Gallic mail while their short swords sought the gaps between armor plates. For a moment, it seemed as if Varro's confidence had been justified, as the Carthaginian line bent backward under the tremendous pressure of the Roman assault. Gallic warriors, their colorful shields splintering under Roman blades, began to give ground step by bloody step. But this retreat was not the collapse it appeared to be. Instead, it was the most crucial element of Hannibal's masterpiece, a fighting withdrawal so perfectly executed that it seemed almost choreographed. The Gallic and Spanish warriors fell back not in panic but in order, their line bending like a bow under tension but never breaking. They traded space for time, blood for position, drawing the eager Roman legions ever deeper into the carefully prepared killing ground. And so, the trap was complete. As the Roman center pushed deeper into what they believed was victory, Hannibal's African veterans closed like the jaws of death, crushing the legions from both flanks while his cavalry sealed their doom from behind. In a single afternoon, the greatest army Rome had ever fielded was obliterated, 70,000 souls feeding the dusty earth of Cannae. Yet from this darkest hour, Rome would rise again, learning that true strength lies not in numbers alone, but in the wisdom to adapt and endure. The echoes of that August day still whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that brilliance can triumph over brute force, and that sometimes the greatest victories are born from the ashes of devastating defeat.